Tyrion sat alone in a dimly lit alcove beneath the Red Keep, the faint glow of a single lantern illuminating the dust motes that danced in the stagnant air. His breath was slow and steady, as if time meant little here, as if the world above, the world of kings and queens and knights and dragons, were a realm removed from his private kingdom of shadows. In his hand he held a thin piece of parchment. On its surface was a series of neat lines, coded not in letters but in a cipher of shapes that only he understood. After all, Tyrion Lannister had always been a man of secrets. He had worn many faces: the disgraced son, the cunning counselor, the half-human demon in his father's eyes, the unexpected hero in the eyes of some. But few realized that behind all those guises lay something far more dangerous, far more calculating, and far more patient than any of them suspected. His eyes, though often described as mismatched in literature, were in truth a single color that shone with cunning when lit by that lantern. A shadow flickered across the stone wall behind him, dancing grotesquely as he shifted his weight on the cool floor. The coded lines on the parchment might have seemed meaningless to anyone else, but to Tyrion, they told a story of supply routes, compromised gold shipments, mercenary loyalties, and the shifting alliances of nearly every noble house. Even the smallest detail was vital. A single spool of thread heading to the Riverlands, a bag of onions going west, a ship of grains rerouted north. All of these, in the right proportions and the right contexts, could tip the balance of the entire realm. For years, Tyrion had gathered information the way a spider gathers dust in the corners of an old house. But unlike the infamous Varys, whom Tyrion once admired for his network of whispers, he did not merely collect it. Tyrion shaped it, twisted it, and sent it back out into the world like tiny seeds. Those seeds sprouted in the minds of lords and ladies, in the war councils of kings, and in the illusions of queens. The seeds gave birth to mistrust or confidence, to new treaties or clandestine betrayals, to half-truths that made men believe they fought for a cause bigger than themselves, even as Tyrion tugged on the strings behind them all. That night, the distant echo of footsteps reminded Tyrion that he was not, in fact, immune to the presence of the outside world. But no one ever thought to search this particular alcove so deep beneath the keep. The footsteps faded, and he was once again alone with his secret. Leaning forward, he took a quill from a small leather pouch at his waist, dipped it into a vial of ink, and added a single mark to his coded parchment. A subtle alteration that would mean everything to one of his intermediaries. Then, he smiled to himself, folded the parchment so tightly it could fit into a child's palm, and slipped it into an inner pocket of his doublet. He stood, dusted off his knees, and made his careful way back to the more familiar corridors, the authoritative swagger returning to his steps as if he had been on no more than a casual walk. But in the back of his mind, he was already planning the next move, as he had been planning every move of this so-called war for far longer than most would guess. He first tested the extent of his influence on a smaller scale. Back when he served as Hand of the King for Joffrey, Tyrion had discovered just how deeply one could manipulate events by controlling the flow of money and information. King's Landing was a nest of vipers, each viper wearing a mask more elaborate than the last. Whether it was Peter Baelish smirking behind his schemes or Varys with his beloved little birds, Tyrion found that subtle misinformation proved as sharp and deadly as any sword. He learned that the shape of power itself was malleable, and that was his first glimpse of the game he would come to master in secret. He might have left that game behind forever had fate not intervened. Crossing the narrow sea to find refuge with Daenerys Targaryen, Tyrion had intended at first only to survive. And then, seeing the woman who called herself the Breaker of Chains, he had begun to think that here was someone he could truly follow. In some ways, he admired Daenerys's fierce sense of justice, her raw determination. Yet even as he admired her, Tyrion realized that if he was to remain relevant, if he was to ensure the future he had begun to outline in coded scrolls, he had to remain not only her advisor but her architect. He needed to plant illusions in her mind, illusions that she could make this war her own. He needed to hint at strategies that would chip away at the Lannisters while simultaneously forging alliances that would bring the realm to its knees. Ready not just for Daenerys but for something deeper, something that only Tyrion understood. He was grateful, in a cold and calculating way, for the Targaryen power of dragons. The realm needed an external threat dramatic enough to unify or destroy, something large and fire-breathing, so that it would mask the subtlety of Tyrion's own machinations. It was perfect. The world would see a queen guided by the small but brilliant Lannister, unaware that his true motivations twisted and turned at every angle. The world would see the Targaryen host devastate armies across the continent, scorching the field at the Field of Fire Reborn, while Tyrion quietly adjusted the balance of power with his whispered counsel. And the world would see the Lannisters fight back for their pride, for their gold, for their thirst for dominion, never knowing that the letters that arrived in Cersei's bedchamber or the ravens that flew from the Red Keep were but illusions shaped by Tyrion's steady hand. If Daenerys was the blazing sun, Tyrion was the hand that directed the prism, scattering the light into 1,000 angles. More importantly, he was the one who decided which corner of the realm remained in darkness, and which corner glowed with new possibilities. Such a plan needed time to blossom. It needed misdirection so sophisticated that none would suspect the ultimate cause. Tyrion was patient. He spent hours listening to Daenerys' fervent speeches about breaking the wheel. He watched her with measured respect, analyzing the tilt of her chin when she doubted herself and the fire in her eyes when she spoke of justice. Whenever she grew too certain, he would slip in a veiled caution, fueling her hesitation just enough to keep her from soaring too high without his counsel. Whenever she wavered, he bolstered her confidence, reminding her of her birthright. Meanwhile, his ravens flew in every direction, sometimes carrying false letters under the Lannister seal, sometimes marked with an obscure sigil that would route them toward the north or Dorne, and sometimes containing coded instructions to mercenary captains, telling them to switch sides at the perfect moment. The effect was slow but palpable. Armies marched in circles that no general could fully explain. Each house, from the proudest to the most humble, found itself at odds with former allies and clinging to alliances they never would have considered. Little by little, Tyrion tested how far his manipulations could go. And each time, when everything was on the brink of chaos, Tyrion would give just enough direction for the great lords and ladies to suspect they had found a solution themselves, thus restoring a fragile order and ensuring they clung to his guidance. Wars demand scapegoats. Wars demand illusions. Tyrion was prepared to be the scapegoat for some and the savior for others, if that was what it took. Above all, he needed to manage his siblings. Jaime's sense of honor and Cersei's cold cunning were equally potent forces. He understood that if either of them suspected his grand design, he might not live to see the outcome. But he also understood their weaknesses. Cersei's vanity and thirst for absolute power made her pliable. She would not heed the small hints that her greatest threat was not Daenerys but her own pride. Jaime, on the other hand, was a man of devotion. His sense of right and wrong had grown complicated over the years, and Tyrion knew exactly how to exploit Jaime's guilt, how to push him closer to the sense that the Lannisters were doomed if they did not accept the right alliances. He fed Jaime's fragile hope even as he tormented Cersei with well-placed rumors. While Cersei came to suspect that all the world conspired against her, and thus reaffirmed her resolve to fight alone, Jaime began to believe that the only way out of this endless cycle of bloodshed was to look toward the Targaryen queen. Neither sibling knew how meticulously Tyrion arranged these illusions. Each was a pawn, dangerously underestimated or overestimated by everyone else in the realm. Tyrion alone saw them for who they were, and he used that knowledge to shape them like clay. Once, in a private corner of the Targaryen war camp, Missandei observed Tyrion studying a map. Missandei was wise, cautious, and unwavering in her loyalty to Daenerys. As she approached, Tyrion had the presence of mind to move a stack of scrolls discreetly over the coded paper he had been studying. He offered Missandei an affable smile, the one he had practiced since childhood to disarm suspicious glances. She asked him about the supply lines, and he obliged her with the expected information. He spoke of how they might seize the major roads leading from Casterly Rock, how the Unsullied could handle a certain flank. But what he did not tell her was that the map of supply lines and the actual coded instructions beneath that map told two very different stories. If she had spotted the faint lines of cipher, she gave no sign. She left Tyrion with a bow of her head and a thoughtful gleam in her eyes. In his chest, his heart beat faster, for a single moment of doubt creeping in. Could Missandei suspect something? He knew that if she pieced it together, she might warn Daenerys. But he also knew that a direct confrontation with him would require proof, and cunning though Missandei was, proof against Tyrion was like smoke in the wind. The war escalated. On a day of sweltering heat, the dragons soared above a Lannister convoy transporting gold from Highgarden to King's Landing. The ambush was swift and brutal. Tyrion stood on a nearby hill, his posture tense as he watched the Dothraki scream and charge across the plains. The gold-laden wagons ignited under the dragon's breath, the smell of burning flesh and scorched metal filling the air. Across the river, Jaime Lannister witnessed the carnage with horror. Tyrion's eyes flicked from the roaring dragon to the armies below and back to his brother's figure, small and vulnerable on the opposite bank. He felt a stirring of old love for Jaime, but also a sense of satisfaction. The war's brutality would push Jaime further toward doubt. It would fracture his loyalties more deeply, perhaps pushing him to the brink of turning away from Cersei's relentless path. Everything was going according to plan, though at the cost of countless lives. Tyrion accepted that cost with the resignation of a man who believed he was shaping the realm toward a future no one else could see. It was not that Tyrion took pleasure in bloodshed. He had experienced too much of war's horrors firsthand to ever revel in it. Rather, he saw it as a necessary ingredient in the cauldron of transformation. To shape the Seven Kingdoms, to rid it of the old corrupt power structures, there had to be a cataclysm. Daenerys's dragons were that cataclysm, but they alone would not suffice. People needed to be kept in a constant state of flux, never entirely secure, never entirely hopeless, so that they would cling to the illusions Tyrion provided them. In time, he would steer events toward a conclusion that no one expected, and in his mind, that conclusion was far better than leaving the realm to the old ways of incompetent kings and cruel queens. While he was in Daenerys's camp, Tyrion sent secret communiques to King's Landing. Some reached Qyburn, the pale man whose knowledge of dark arts was as unsettling as his unwavering loyalty to Cersei. The messages always contained some fragment of truth and some fragment of a lie. They would inspire Cersei to attempt certain strategies, encouraging her to invest resources in fortifications that Tyrion secretly knew were vulnerabilities. He guided her to place her forces in positions that, when the time was right, could be surrounded by the Dothraki or the Unsullied. On the other hand, he also fed Daenerys a mixture of truths and fabrications, ensuring that her sense of inevitability remained strong. So strong that she might overlook subtleties in the terrain, or assume the unswerving loyalty of nearby regions, leaving her open to small losses that would keep the war going just a bit longer. In the north, the rumor grew that a more significant threat loomed in the lands beyond the wall. News of whites and white walkers trickled down, whispered around tavern fires and gossiped about in castle courtyards. Tyrion knew from his old readings that the Long Night was not just a fairy tale. He had once held an odd sense of dread for the possibility of an undead army, but at some point that dread became part of his strategy. Another external threat was perfect for layering illusions. The lords and ladies of the realm were so busy interpreting messages of ice and fire that it gave Tyrion room to maneuver. If the living had to unite to face a single apocalyptic enemy, then perhaps it would all come down to who controlled that unity. Perhaps that was where Tyrion saw his greatest gamble, that the living would not realize who guided their shaky alliance until it was too late. Soon enough, even Daenerys herself was drawn into the notion of forging a truce to address the threat of the undead. Tyrion, feigning reluctance, encouraged a parley between the two queens. He orchestrated a meeting in the Dragon Pit, a place that resonated with the old Targaryen legacy, a place that would fill Cersei with unease. He ensured that all the spectacle was in Daenerys's favor, her grand entrance upon the back of a dragon, the presence of the captured white to showcase the reality of the threat. Meanwhile, Cersei played her part, feigning cooperation while harboring treacherous intentions. Tyrion stepped in to mediate, to propose negotiations, to appear the voice of reason. He looked from sister to queen, from queen to queen, as though he were torn in his loyalties. In truth, he was carefully measuring each reaction, each flicker of emotion, each fearful glance. From all these details, he gleaned how best to push them both further toward desperation. At the end of that gathering, Cersei agreed to support the fight against the undead, or so she claimed. In reality, Tyrion had calculated that she would never truly commit her armies, at least not wholeheartedly. As he spoke to her in private, she let slip her plan to betray Daenerys at the earliest opportunity. Tyrion feigned shock and sorrow, but inside, he felt an electric thrill. His sister's betrayal was another tile in the grand mosaic he was arranging. A betrayal, once revealed at the right moment, could serve as a catalyst for further conflict. And more conflict meant more chaos. Chaos that Tyrion alone navigated with clarity. That was the difference. While everyone else drowned in reaction, Tyrion calmly stayed the course he had charted. He was not omnipotent. There were moments when the realm surprised him, or threatened to unravel the threads he had so carefully woven. Word reached him that Jon Snow, some said he was king in the north, had bent the knee to Daenerys and that the two had grown close. Tyrion had not anticipated the depth of Daenerys' feelings for this brooding northerner. He sensed that this bond could either strengthen his war plan by uniting the Targaryen forces with the north, or tear it apart if either Jon or Daenerys acted rashly for the sake of love. He watched them from the corner of his eye, calculating how to use their union. Still, he wondered if perhaps they might prove a threat to his illusions if they realized that neither queen nor king was the true orchestrator of events. Time pressed on, and winter sank its icy claws into the Seven Kingdoms. Travel between armies slowed under snows and storms, but the war did not abate. Skirmishes flared, ravens flew, and alliances shifted. At each turn, Tyrion read the coded reports from his agents with meticulous care, occasionally adjusting the grand tapestry with a single pen stroke, a single whispered suggestion. The Targaryen host managed to sweep through parts of the Crownlands, capturing key fortresses, but they bled men to do it. Meanwhile, Cersei's cunning led to a few surprising victories. Surprising unless one realized that Tyrion had arranged for certain Targaryen commanders to be fed misinformation about the Lannister troop movements. Each victory or defeat was a stone in the building of his ultimate structure. His aim was not to destroy one side outright, but to drive both sides to their greatest extremes, each believing they had a path to victory, each suspecting that only a final, cataclysmic confrontation could decide the fate of the realm. He kept a close watch on the Iron Bank's maneuvers, for the Iron Bank cared not for blood but for gold. In their ledgers, Tyrion saw an opportunity. He arranged for Daenerys to seize certain shipments of Lannister gold, only enough to cause a stir, not enough to cripple them entirely. He also arranged for the news of those seized shipments to reach the Iron Bank in a highly embellished form, prompting them to reconsider their loans to the crown. All the while, Tyrion made subtle suggestions to Daenerys about the necessity of repaying at least some portion of the crown's debts once she took the Iron Throne. The result was a financial stalemate, with the Iron Bank leaning forward on the edge of uncertainty, just as Tyrion wished. Nobody was sure where to place their trust, not even the usually detached bankers of Bravos. The more uncertain they grew, the more essential Tyrion's counsel became. Doors that would have been closed to him opened by necessity. Whispers that might have remained in the dark were offered to him in hopes that he could interpret them. By making himself indispensable to both sides, though openly he was Daenerys' hand, he expanded his network of influence like roots beneath an ancient oak. What Tyrion desired most was that final turn of the wheel, that final moment when all the illusions fell away and the realm realized it had been spun into a new shape. Would they blame him? Perhaps, but by then, it would be too late for them to revert to the old ways. He envisioned a future in which the feudal houses were forced into a more balanced arrangement, one in which the old allegiances had been shattered and reformed according to necessity rather than tradition. He imagined a realm in which the small folk, weary of endless war, might be more willing to accept changes that even Daenerys had not fully articulated. In this vision, the Targaryen queen might still sit on the throne or perhaps not. Tyrion, in his private fantasies, did not fixate on who wore the crown. Instead, he fixated on the structure of power itself, built anew after the realm had been thoroughly broken. One cold twilight, long after the sun had sunk below the horizon, Tyrion found himself in a damp corridor of Dragonstone, torch in hand. The flickering flame cast eerie shadows on the walls, revealing carvings left by the ancient Valyrians. Daenerys was in the council room, no doubt conferring with Grey Worm and Missandei, or perhaps sharing a somber exchange with Jon Snow. Tyrion was supposed to be attending, but he had excused himself on the premise of needing fresh air. He paused before a section of wall that depicted dragons in flight, their wings spanning the stones like living creatures. He ran his hand across the carving, marveling at how time had not eroded these shapes. Then he removed a small scroll from the inside of his jacket. The coded lines told him that the Golden Company had arrived in Westeros, courtesy of Cersei's negotiation. He already knew that, of course. But the real news was that the Sellswords had been quietly approached by an intermediary, not from Cersei, but from Tyrion himself. The Golden Company prided itself on its contracts and its history, but gold spoke to them more deeply than oaths, especially if that gold came with a promise of a profitable future. Through carefully placed investments, Tyrion had ensured that certain captains of the Golden Company would remember that their true loyalty was to coin above all. They would fight for Cersei when the time came, but if the tide turned or if a more favorable contract presented itself, they would turn cloak at just the right moment. Tyrion was counting on that. A sudden betrayal by the Golden Company could break Cersei's last line of defense and push the capital into Daenerys' hands. It was a dance with fate, because if Cersei discovered the plan, she would be forced to act preemptively, possibly unleashing the wildfire stored beneath King's Landing. Tyrion hoped that she would remain blinded by her own hubris. He gambled on her trust in her cunning, ironically unaware that hers was no match for the labyrinth he had crafted. As Tyrion's footsteps echoed in the corridor, he remembered the first time his father had truly humiliated him in public. It was at a feast in Casterly Rock many years ago, before the War of the Five Kings. Tyrion had made a pointed remark about the extravagance of the Lannister lifestyle. Tywin Lannister, in front of a host of nobles, berated him as a foolish, sniveling disappointment. Tyrion had stood there, face burning, feeling smaller than he already was, as laughter rippled across the assembled lords and ladies. From that moment on, Tyrion had promised himself that if he could not have his father's respect, he would have the last word in a far grander sense. He would reshape the realm into a place where men like Tywin did not simply inherit power, where cruelty and arrogance did not pass from father to son as easily as a signet ring. Now, in these corridors, with a war raging outside, Tyrion felt that old humiliation morph into a quiet triumph. Tywin was gone, but the realm still danced to a Lannister tune. Only it was a Lannister's tune Tywin could never have composed. He made his way to the council chamber, entering with an apologetic expression that held just enough sincerity to mask his deeper thoughts. Daenerys, seated at the head of a polished obsidian table, raised her eyebrows at his tardiness. Jon Snow stood off to the side, arms folded, face set in a perpetual frown that Tyrion had grown used to. Grey Worm was silent, watchful. Missandei acknowledged Tyrion with a small nod. They were discussing the next move. Should they march on King's Landing immediately, or handle the threat in the north first? The storm of the undead was no longer just rumor. The Night King had brought ruin to the wall, and the army of the dead was advancing south. Daenerys was torn, wanting to defend the living while also seeking to secure her throne. Tyrion understood that dilemma too well. He counseled caution, suggesting they send a substantial force north to prove Daenerys' commitment to the living, while retaining enough force at Dragonstone to respond if Cersei made a move. The unsaid part of his advice was that more time meant more opportunity for Tyrion to finalize his designs. More time meant the illusions could keep weaving themselves across the realm. Jon Snow argued passionately that the real war lay in the north. Tyrion nodded gravely, reaffirming his sympathy for the northern cause, all the while imagining how the realm would be upended once the Walking Dead clashed with the combined armies. He saw in his mind the final stroke of devastation that would force all players to accept a new reality. He also saw the risk. If the dead proved unstoppable, all his plans would be for nothing. But then, Tyrion Lannister had always believed that if the dead truly overwhelmed the living, no throne would matter. In that sense, he was not so different from Jon Snow, who fought for the survival of humanity above all else. The difference was that Jon fought honestly, while Tyrion used the war as a crucible to forge a new shape for the Seven Kingdoms. If in the process he also saved humanity, so be it. He would not let the realm fall, but he intended to see it reborn. Thus began a sequence of events that would stretch the war in two directions, one toward the icy north and the other toward the throne in King's Landing. The living braced themselves against the tide of death, forging alliances that Tyrion helped guide. Daenerys and her dragons flew north in a grand display of power, scorching undead ranks in blazes of dragon fire. The Lannisters, under Cersei's command, publicly held back, claiming the need to defend the capital in case Daenerys returned. Yet they pursued hidden diplomatic maneuvers, seeking alliances with any who feared the Targaryen queen's might. Meanwhile, Tyrion's ravens continued their silent migration, carrying coded words that shaped the nature of victory and defeat in every corner of the realm. As the snows fell thicker and the nights grew longer, a great battle against the undead unfolded at the fortress of Winterfell. Tyrion was present, for Daenerys refused to stand aside while the living fought for existence. He stood upon the battlements, a frown etched on his features as the dead crashed against the living. The whites were as relentless as the stories said. In the night sky, one dragon roared flame while another clashed with an undead counterpart. The spectacle of it was both majestic and horrifying. Tyrion's short stature and lack of battle prowess kept him from the thick of the fight, but from his vantage, he saw the lines of men and women break, reform, break again, and hold. It reminded him that all illusions vanish in the face of death, that all cunning pales when confronting the endless void. For a moment he almost doubted. Perhaps all his schemes would be meaningless if the undead triumphed. But as dawn neared, the living claimed a narrow victory, thanks to a confluence of heroism, dragon fire, and sacrifices too numerous to recount. The realm saw that it could stand, if barely, against the darkness. Once again hope was kindled, and once again Tyrion saw an opening. In the aftermath of that battle, while Winterfell's courtyards swarmed with the wounded and the grieving, Tyrion sought out Jon Snow. He found him standing by the ruined gates, eyes distant. Jon looked exhausted, streaks of blood dried on his face, his sword arm trembling from fatigue. Tyrion approached with careful steps, wearing an expression of genuine sympathy. He spoke softly, praising Jon's bravery and the leadership of the North. Then he delicately maneuvered the conversation toward the future. Now that the dead had been repelled, at least for the time being, where would Jon Snow stand in regard to the throne? Jon, with his typical grim honesty, insisted that there was only one rightful queen in his eyes, and that was Daenerys. Tyrion let that statement hang in the cold air, his mind darting through possibilities. He told Jon that Daenerys, too, recognized the heroism of the North, and that she intended to honor her alliances. It was a gentle reassurance, designed to deepen Jon's trust while planting the idea that Daenerys was not just a foreign conqueror but a partner in the realm's salvation. In truth, Tyrion thought that if Daenerys grew too consumed by the ambition for the Iron Throne, she might alienate the Northern Lords. If she grew too entangled in her feelings for Jon, she might forget the broader game. Tyrion needed her balanced on the edge of caution and daring. Too many victories, and she would become reckless. Too many defeats, and her cause would crumble. Meanwhile, he also needed Cersei to remain confident enough to challenge Daenerys, but paranoid enough to lash out at potential betrayers, thus ensuring a more divided realm that would require Tyrion's guiding hand. As the armies licked their wounds and the snows showed no sign of receding, Tyrion carefully orchestrated the next phase. He sent coded letters to Dorne, to the Iron Islands, to the scattered remnants of House Tyrell's bannermen. In each letter, he laid out a scenario that served their interests, slightly differently each time, dangling promises of future prosperity if they aligned with Daenerys at the opportune moment. At the same time, he arranged for a few missives to fall into Cersei's hands, each letter detailing how certain regions might rally to her cause if she offered them enough concessions. Each promise was half true and half lie, but it was enough to keep both sides believing they had a shot at turning the tables. If only they would fight a little harder, bleed a little more, last a little longer. And so the war dragged on through the bitter winter. Skirmishes erupted from the Reach to the Stormlands, dragons clashed with Lannister scorpions, and the Golden Company landed in the Crownlands, forging a temporary bulwark for Cersei's cause. Tyrion stood by Daenerys' side, yet quietly pulled invisible levers that shaped the realm's destiny. No one suspected the full extent of his manipulation. Some, like Varys, harbored vague doubts, but even the spider had grown less formidable, less certain in the face of the chaos Tyrion unleashed. Others, like Missandei, might have glimpsed the edges of Tyrion's cunning, but they had no proof and no reason to assume that a single man, especially the dwarf who had so long been underestimated, could be the puppet master of the realm's greatest conflict. Then came a day that Tyrion had both anticipated and feared, the day when Daenerys' grief drove her to extremes. In the course of battle, a sudden strike by Euron Greyjoy's fleet, combined with scorpion bolts from the city walls, had brought down one of her dragons. The beast's dying roars echoed across the waters of Blackwater Bay. Daenerys' face contorted with despair, and in that moment, Tyrion felt a shift in her that even he might struggle to control. Grief turned to rage, rage to a thirst for vengeance. Tyrion counseled restraint, but he saw in her eyes the reflection of dragon fire. She was close to unleashing a final, devastating assault on King's Landing, something that, if done without strategy, could destroy half the city and turn the populace against her. Tyrion needed to pull her back from that edge, yet he also needed to ensure that when she finally did act, the city would fall in a way that enabled him to shape its future. In a desperate attempt to avert catastrophe, Tyrion proposed a final parley, a chance to minimize bloodshed. He knew Cersei would not negotiate in good faith, but it might buy Tyrion time to adjust some final pieces. Daenerys reluctantly agreed, still mourning her lost dragon. They marched their armies to the outskirts of King's Landing, forming a precarious siege line. Tens of thousands of innocent people cowered within the city walls, uncertain whether the next dawn would bring them salvation or an inferno. Tyrion sought out Jaime, who had slipped back into the city to appeal to Cersei's humanity, assuming she still possessed any. Jaime found himself torn, and Tyrion leveraged that internal battle, telling Jaime that if he cared at all for the people inside those walls, he would find a way to force Cersei's surrender. Jaime, driven by guilt and love, attempted just that, but Cersei would not relent. She locked him in the dungeons for his betrayal, certain that she alone deserved the throne. That very night, Tyrion bribed a guard to free Jaime. He did it not simply out of brotherly love, but because he needed Jaime to plant a final seed of doubt in Cersei if possible, and if not, to at least escape the city before Daenerys unleashed her fury. Tyrion was gambling that Jaime, freed from the dungeon, might shatter Cersei's resolve at the last moment, or at least make her hesitate. A hesitation could be everything Tyrion needed to force the Golden Company to reveal their true loyalties, or to pave the way for the city's peaceful surrender. But if it did not happen, if Daenerys torched the city, Tyrion's illusions would still find purchase in the aftermath of the ashes. Dawn broke on the day that would decide the fate of King's Landing. The walls stood tall, lined with archers and scorpions. The Golden Company arrayed themselves before the city gates, a formidable line of disciplined sellswords. Tyrion stood at Daenerys' side, his eyes scanning the battlements, searching for any sign of a white flag. All around them, the Targaryen forces braced for the command to charge. The air was thick with tension and the stench of fear. From somewhere in the distance, a child wailed. It was a jarring reminder that real people, innocents, were caught in the jaws of this monstrous war. Daenerys mounted Drogon, the sole remaining dragon, and soared into the sky. The city below trembled at the sound of beating wings. Tyrion could scarcely breathe as he watched, uncertain whether Jaime had succeeded. If Cersei refused to surrender, it would come to fire and blood. For a moment, time seemed suspended. Then, to Tyrion's horror, he saw the flash of dragon fire. Daenerys unleashed her wrath upon the scorpions, upon the Golden Company, upon the very gates of King's Landing. In an instant, the sellsword's proud formation was reduced to ash and screams, their banners engulfed in flames. The dragon roared, swooping along the walls, incinerating archers and siege engines alike. The city's defenses collapsed in a matter of minutes. Yet Tyrion had not foreseen what came next. Perhaps in her grief, Daenerys went further than any plan Tyrion had laid. The bells of surrender began to ring, a sound that might have signaled the city's capitulation. But Daenerys, driven by anguish and rage, either did not hear or did not care. She soared deeper into the city, raining dragon fire on the streets below. Buildings ignited like tinder. People fled in all directions, their screams forming a macabre chorus. Tyrion's heart pounded in horror. This was not the precise strategic strike he had envisioned, nor the carefully orchestrated surrender that would allow him to reshape the realm without wholesale slaughter. This was an inferno of vengeance. Perhaps a part of him always knew it could come to this, but in his arrogance, he believed he could steer Daenerys away from such madness. Now, the illusions he had built might burn along with the city itself. Still, amid the chaos, Tyrion felt a flicker of grim resolve. Even if the city burned, there would be an aftermath. He might still seize the threads of destiny from the ashes. If Daenerys reigned after this slaughter, she would face the scorn of the realm. Perhaps in that vacuum of faith, Tyrion could rise as the single figure of reason. He stood there, hands shaking, as the Targaryen forces rushed in behind the broken gates. The Lannister soldiers dropped their swords, stunned by the scale of destruction. The war was as good as won. Yet Tyrion's soul was heavy. The bells kept ringing, their peals drowned by the roar of fire. Smoke rose in thick, dark columns, blotting out the sun. By midday, King's Landing lay in smoldering ruin. Thousands of corpses lined the streets, and even more fled into the countryside in a desperate bid for survival. Daenerys landed Drogon near the Red Keep, her face streaked with soot and tears, fury still burning in her eyes. Tyrion approached her slowly, his voice catching in his throat as he tried to speak. He wanted to tell her that she had gone too far, that this was not what he had planned. But the words stuck. He realized that, in her mind, his counsel had failed. She had lost Rhaegal, she had lost Missandei, she had lost so many. And now she had unleashed her own form of justice. What place was there for counsel in this blackened ruin of a city? That afternoon, Daenerys declared herself the rightful queen of the Seven Kingdoms, claiming victory. A hush fell across the Targaryen ranks. Some cheered weakly, others looked on in horror. Tyrion gazed across the city to the battered towers of the Red Keep, half collapsed from Drogon's onslaught. A swirl of ash drifted through the air like snow. He wondered if Cersei still lived somewhere under the rubble, clinging to life, or if she had perished as the walls came down. In the days that followed, Daenerys set up her seat of power in the ruined capital. Tyrion watched her begin to remake the city in the only way she knew how, with unwavering will, mixed with fear. She sent the Unsullied into the rubble to impose order. Executions of Lannister loyalists became commonplace. Tyrion recognized that the realm now saw Daenerys not as a merciful liberator but as a conqueror shrouded in blood and fire. The illusions he had so painstakingly cultivated were overshadowed by the raw image of destruction. Still, he had to adapt. He met with various lords who trickled in, uncertain whether to bow or flee. He offered them half-truths, repeating the queen's vow to break the wheel. In private, though, he struggled with the knowledge that the wheel she spoke of might simply be replaced by a harsher tyranny. Yet Tyrion was not done. Behind the devastation of King's Landing, he moved quietly to influence the survivors. He arranged for supply lines to funnel food into the city, earning some goodwill among the desperate populace. He oversaw the reorganization of the City Watch, placing men who he believed might be loyal to him before they were loyal to the queen. He sent ravens to the far corners of the realm, urging them to accept Daenerys' rule, highlighting the threat of foreign invasion if Westeros remained divided. With one hand, he tried to mitigate the horrors Daenerys had unleashed, and with the other, he continued to ensure that every political leader in Westeros depended on him to navigate this precarious new reality. Slowly, a new power structure formed amid the ashes. Houses that had once knelt to the Lannisters or Baratheons found themselves negotiating with Daenerys's new hand of the queen, Tyrion Lannister. The North, led by the newly hailed King Bran Stark or Queen Sansa Stark, depending on one telling or another, also entered negotiations, uncertain whether to remain independent or to reconcile with the Iron Throne. Dorne, the Iron Islands, and other distant regions weighed their options, each aware of the devastation that dragons could bring. In every negotiation, every letter, Tyrion was there, shaping the conversation. With Cersei gone, her fate still uncertain but presumed fatal, and Daenerys viewed with fear and awe, Tyrion became the single thread that connected them all, the calm voice in a storm of dread. Weeks turned to months. Reconstruction began in King's Landing, though the scars of fire were everywhere. Daenerys, riding Drogon through the skies, made a point of terrifying any who considered rebellion. The populace whispered that a new mad queen sat the throne, and Tyrion wondered if they might not be entirely wrong. He found himself in council meetings, quietly steering Daenerys away from her darker impulses, reminding her of the need to win hearts as well as battles. She listened sometimes, but he could see the flicker in her eyes that said trust was fragile. One night, alone in his chambers in the charred remnants of the Red Keep, Tyrion unrolled a fresh sheet of parchment and began writing in his cipher. He summarized the realm's new distribution of power, the stances of the major houses, the capacity of the Unsullied garrison, the location of the Dothraki Khalasars. He noted the acceptance of Daenerys's rule in certain areas, the stubborn resistance in others, and he began to outline a new phase, a careful push toward a more balanced governance, perhaps through the establishment of a council that would keep the queen in check. He toyed with the idea that the Iron Throne, physically melted by the dragon's wrath, might no longer be the literal seat of power. He even considered the question of succession, though Daenerys had no heirs. If something were to happen to her, who would rule? The question was more than academic. Tyrion was shaping a realm in which absolute monarchy might be tempered by a council, a realm where the small folk might have some say, however small. It was a grand vision, and he believed he alone could shepherd it into existence. Yet for all his clarity, Tyrion could not completely banish the memory of Daenerys in the sky, raining fire upon innocent people. He knew that no illusions could erase that truth. He realized that the realm might never fully recover from the trauma of that day. If anything, it would exist in a state of fearful reverence for dragons and their riders. Perhaps, Tyrion thought, that fear would keep them from reverting to the old feuds and petty wars that had once torn Westeros apart. Or perhaps it would breed a new cycle of rebellion, as people rose up against tyranny. If that happened, Tyrion would find a way to guide that rebellion, too. He saw each crisis as a chance to mold the realm closer to his vision. He had come this far, orchestrating the entire war between the Lannisters and the Targaryens, playing his siblings and the Dragon Queen like well-tuned instruments. Why should he stop now? In the months that followed, the illusions continued but took on a different shape. Tyrion was no longer pushing two sides to war. Rather, he was channeling the aftermath to ensure that Daenerys did not become the unstoppable tyrant she might be tempted to be. He played the role of the well-meaning hand, bridging gaps between the queen and her new subjects, defusing conflicts through negotiation. He planted ideas among the lords, whispering of the queen's benevolence when she chose mercy, ensuring those stories spread. He also arranged for discreet punishments when local lords abused their power, attributing those punishments to the queen's sense of justice. Gradually, he cultivated an image of Daenerys as both feared and fair, an image that might stabilize the realm just enough to let it heal. Through it all, he balanced on a razor's edge, never letting Daenerys realize how completely he guided her public persona. During one tense meeting with several lords from the Reach, Tyrion nearly slipped. The lords complained bitterly about new taxes imposed to fund the reconstruction of King's Landing. Tyrion pointed out the necessity of rebuilding the capital after the ravages of war. The lords countered that the Targaryen queen's wrath had caused much of the destruction, so why should they pay for it? Tyrion, irritated, laid out a subtle threat, suggesting that refusing the taxes might be seen as an act of rebellion. One of the lords, Lord Oakhearth, gave Tyrion a sharp look and said, "Is that truly what the queen believes? Or is that what you would have us think she believes?" For an instant, Tyrion felt his heart skip. The question held a dangerous implication, that perhaps the queen's words and Tyrion's words were not one and the same. But Tyrion collected himself and calmly replied that the queen and her hand spoke with one voice. The lords did not press further, unwilling to risk open defiance. But Tyrion sensed that suspicion was not fully laid to rest. At night, he sometimes dreamed of a different ending. An ending where the city had surrendered at the sound of the bells, where Daenerys had shown mercy, and the realm had embraced her as a benevolent queen. In that dream, Tyrion's illusions had led to a more peaceful transition. But when he woke, he saw the blackened ruins, smelled the char of burned timbers, and heard the ghostly echoes of sobbing survivors. He realized that illusions, no matter how artful, could not entirely control the cruelty of men or the rage of a dragon queen. They could only guide events to a certain threshold. Beyond that threshold, chaos took over, and chaos was a dangerous ally. It gave birth to opportunities, but it also devoured carefully laid plans. Still, if anyone in Westeros could tame chaos, it was Tyrion. He had, after all, orchestrated the entire war between the Lannisters and the Targaryens, turning the might of two great houses against each other, breaking the old order, scattering alliances, and paving the way for a new shape to emerge. He had done so quietly, patiently, for years, and as the realm slowly rebuilt itself, as Daenerys sat in the Red Keep overshadowed by fear and longing for her lost dragons, Tyrion was the one figure who seemed indispensable. He was the link between the queen and her new subjects, between the remnants of House Lannister and the Targaryen regime, between the horrors of the past war and the fragile hope for the future. He was everywhere and nowhere, a small man in a vast realm, carrying secrets in coded parchments, whispering suggestions into the ears of lords, ladies, and perhaps even the queen in her darkest hours. Some wondered if Tyrion ever harbored regrets for the innocent lives lost, for the friends betrayed or manipulated in the process. He did. Late at night, with a cup of wine in his hand, he sometimes felt the weight of his conscience press upon him. He would think of Shay, of Podrick, of Bronn, of all those who had come and gone through his life. He would remember the bond he once had with Jaime, the twisted dance of hatred and love with Cersei, and for a moment, he would feel the pang of what might have been if he had chosen a different path. But then he would recall Tywin's scorn, Joffrey's cruelty, the stupidity of small-minded lords drunk on their own importance, the arrogance of the monarchy, the broken promises to the common folk. He would remember how the realm had suffered under incompetent kings and oppressive regimes, and he would tell himself that his manipulations, though merciless at times, were aimed at saving the realm from its own worst self. He was, as he saw it, the necessary villain to birth a better world, if only the realm would endure long enough to see the shape of that world. The reconstruction continued, and the realm teetered between obedience and rebellion. Daenerys's unsullied patrols kept the streets relatively safe, though the cost in freedom was noticeable. Whispers of discontent simmered in the corners of taverns, in the battered remains of Flea Bottom, in the countryside where fields were scorched and families impoverished. Tyrion's illusions of a swift and glorious new order were gone. Now he struggled to craft illusions of stability, a precarious balance between fear and tentative hope. He negotiated trade agreements with the Iron Bank, ensuring new coin flowed into the city. He sweetened the deal for a few lords in the Reach, winning their public support for the queen. He quietly placated the North, urging them to give Daenerys a chance to prove her intentions now that the undead threat had been vanquished. Each day brought new fires to douse, new half-truths to spin. The tapestry of illusions had grown so large that not even Tyrion could fully see its design anymore, but he pressed on. In the back of his mind, he pondered whether Daenerys would ever truly be the queen he hoped she could be. There were moments, rare but present, when she showed compassion for the war orphans or the refugees streaming into the city. There were also moments of rage when she threatened to unleash Drogon again on any who questioned her rule. Tyrion walked that line carefully, acting as the voice of caution when her temper flared, reminding her that the realm was hers to nurture, not simply to dominate. Whether she believed him or merely tolerated him was often unclear. But each time she heeded him, Tyrion felt a flicker of vindication, a sense that his manipulations were inching the realm toward a new equilibrium. As the dust settled across the Seven Kingdoms, as ships began to sail again, as fields were replanted, as the roads were cleared of debris, the world turned its gaze toward King's Landing to see what would become of the conquered capital. And there stood Tyrion Lannister, the hand of the Queen, smiling politely as foreign envoys approached, as noble houses bowed in uncertain allegiance, as Daenerys Targaryen cloaked herself in the mantle of rule earned through fire and blood. They saw a small man with a scarred face, once dismissed by his own family, now shaping treaties and hearing petitions. They saw a dwarf who had outlived and outmaneuvered some of the greatest players in the game. But they did not see the man behind the illusions, the man who had orchestrated the war between two great houses, who had turned siblings against each other, who had fueled the ambitions of a dragon queen and the paranoia of a lioness, all to break the hold of the old power structures and rewrite the fate of Westeros. Tyrion himself, standing in those council chambers, meeting halls and private corners of the Red Keep, felt a subdued pride. He felt sorrow, too, and an undercurrent of regret. Yet the pride persisted, because he alone knew the entire tapestry of illusions he had spun. He alone understood that every conquest, every betrayal, every fragile alliance, had been part of a grand design, a design that had cost many lives but might, in the end, save even more from the cycle of endless tyranny. Months turned to a year, and in that year the realm slowly began to heal. The scars of King's Landing were still visible in its blackened walls and the outlines of ruined neighborhoods, but new timber and stone arrived from across the sea. Streets were rebuilt, markets reopened, a sense of normalcy tentatively emerged. Daenerys established a new code of justice, influenced heavily by Tyrion's counsel, promising fair trials and impartial rulings, though the line between promise and execution was still too thin for many. Rebellions flared in distant corners, but none gathered enough strength to challenge the Queen, thanks in large part to Tyrion's unseen hand placating potential allies and fracturing potential coalitions before they could rally. And so it was that the war, orchestrated by a single cunning Lannister dwarf, did not end in a perfect peace, but in a battered acceptance of the new order. And Tyrion, each evening, would retire to his private chambers, unroll a fresh parchment, and continue refining his ciphered notes. He catalogued the realm's developments, noted the shifting temperaments of the lords, recorded the Queen's decisions, and weighed the repercussions of each. He saw new storms on the horizon, potential conflicts with Essos, the uncertain loyalties of the North, the unresolved question of succession. He began to plant seeds that might resolve those issues before they grew into another war. He wrote coded instructions for a handful of agents he kept in Dorne, the Vale, the Reach. He arranged a subtle meeting with emissaries from Bravos, hinting that further trade incentives might be given if they supported certain proposals for governance. Ever the architect, he built scaffolding around Daenerys' reign, determined to shape it in a way that might endure. He never spoke of these illusions outright, never claimed credit for the war's outcome. He simply existed at the center of it all, a quiet, unassuming, indispensable figure. To the outside world, it would remain a mystery how the realm had arrived at this uneasy peace, scarred by flame and shadow. Historians might attribute it to Daenerys Targaryen's unyielding will, or to the cunning of House Lannister in its final stand, or to the bravery of the North in holding back the tide of the undead. They might mention Tyrion Lannister in passing, praising or condemning him for his role as the Queen's hand. Few would realize that the lines of cause and effect had been carefully traced by him from the very start. Fewer still would imagine that the war itself had been the instrument of his design, that every battle lost or won, every betrayal, every alliance, every rumor, every coded raven, had formed part of the symphony he conducted from behind a series of masks. But on certain nights, when the moon was high over the battered spires of King's Landing, a solitary figure would climb the steps of the Red Keep, step out onto a ruined balcony, and gaze upon the city. A cup of wine in hand, Tyrion Lannister would lean against the rail, feeling the breeze brush against his face. He might stare at the labyrinth of streets below, the flickering torches of patrols, the clusters of tents where refugees still dwelled, and he would quietly reflect. Behind his mismatched eyes lay memories of the war he had orchestrated, the illusions he had woven, the countless choices that had shaped the realm's destiny. And though no one would ever truly know the depth of his involvement, Tyrion would take another sip of wine and let a small, ironic smile cross his lips. He had done what Tywin Lannister had always wanted. He had shaped the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. Only he had done it not to glorify the name Lannister, but to break the cycles of power that had oppressed so many for so long. Yes, there would be new conflicts, new dangers, new kings and queens who rose and fell. But Tyrion had already set in motion a process that would ensure the old ways did not simply reclaim their stranglehold. Each day, a bit more of the realm's structure changed, giving voice to lords who once were ignored, granting representation to city leaders, forging alliances based on shared interest rather than inherited feuds. And if Daenerys ever realized just how thoroughly her war, and her eventual victory, had been crafted by the mind of her hand, it would likely be too late for her to undo it. Such was Tyrion's final triumph, to remain hidden in plain sight, the secret architect of a war that had reshaped the course of history. Sometimes he would remember the words of those who said he drank and knew things. A simple jest, perhaps, but a telling one. Tyrion had known more than they could have guessed. He had known how to steer the largest conflict in living memory, playing powerful families, monstrous armies, and dragons as pieces on a vast board. Through illusions and half-truths, betrayals and alliances, losses and victories, he had shaped the narrative of the realm, from the moment he served as hand under Joffrey to the moment he stood as hand to the new queen in the ashes of King's Landing. And he knew that, for better or worse, the realm would bear those scars for generations. Yet from those scars, something new might grow, something that broke the wheel of tyranny and replaced it with a cautious hope. Tyrion would finish his wine, and the wind would sigh across the blackened stones. He would think of how this was not an end but a beginning. The illusions did not stop just because the war had ended. In truth, the illusions were more necessary than ever in shaping the aftermath. He would step back into the corridors, where the flicker of torchlight cast shadows on the walls. He would return to his chamber, where coded parchments lay waiting for him. And he would continue his work, weaving the future of the Seven Kingdoms, ensuring that whatever came next, it would not be guided by a single tyrant's whim but by the cunning, careful, endlessly patient mind of Tyrion Lannister. For he had proven that the realm was malleable to those who understood how to shape its illusions, and he had every intention of continuing to shape them, so long as he drew breath. Tyrion Lannister stood on a narrow balcony in the Red Keep, leaning on the scorched parapet as an early morning haze crept across King's Landing. Ash still clung to the cracks between the stones, reminders of the day Dragonfire had torn the city's heart. The faint cries of gulls blended with the murmur of work crews in the streets below. Men carting rubble, builders repairing fractured walls, children seeking scraps in the ruins of their homes. From this vantage, Tyrion could see the vestiges of what the city had been and sense the shape of what it could become. Yet he also knew the bitterness that choked its surviving populace. Fear lingered in the alleys like stale smoke. He straightened, drawing in a careful breath, tasting that lingering ash in the air. Another day to guide, another day to rebuild illusions necessary for the fragile peace he had helped forge. His dark eyes roamed over the battered skyline. The dome of the Great September was gone, reduced to rubble in a fiery blast long before Daenerys' conquest, and the dragon pit's ruined arches still jutted out like broken fangs. The city had known too much destruction. Tyrion could feel that truth in his bones as he turned away from the balcony. Inside what remained of the Red Keep's upper corridors, debris had been cleared enough to allow a semblance of daily life. Damaged tapestries lay folded in corners, half-burned paneling was torn away, and the charred odor hung in the air as persistently as memory. The once grand fortress now felt a hollow, haunted place. Daenerys' seat, yes, but a seat perched upon ruin. He descended a flight of worn steps, their surfaces cracked underfoot, and paused outside a chamber where unsullied guards stood at attention. They acknowledged him with slight nods. He nodded back, pushing open the door into a meeting room lit by lanterns and watery morning light through the high windows. Their Grey Worm waited, his posture rigid. Across from him stood Ser Davos Seaworth, arms folded, expression grave. Missandei was absent, having perished in the last days before the city's fall, and her absence hung like a missing cord in the background of every war council. Davos inclined his head in greeting, though his eyes were cautious. "My Lord Hand," he said, voice quiet yet laced with tension. Tyrion waved a hand. "No need for ceremony so early, Ser Davos. The Queen is not here yet," Grey Worm answered in a flat voice. "She is out with Drogon, patrolling the skies." He shifted his weight, the faint chink of armor betraying his movement. The tension in his face suggested he worried for Daenerys' stability. The city had not recovered from its first taste of a vengeful dragon. The notion of another demonstration of fire was enough to quicken any man's pulse. "Good," Tyrion said, forcing a mild tone. "She can see for herself that the city is cooperating." He had hesitated to use the word cooperating, for it implied a willful consent that King's Landing had not entirely granted. Still, he knew how vital it was for Daenerys to believe her new subjects were acquiescent. "Has she said when she'll return?" Grey Worm shook his head. "She wished to see the city walls, the repairs on the gates." "Let her see." Tyrion flicked his gaze to the table where a scattering of parchments lay. He recognized his own cramped handwriting on some of them, ravens he had sent or replies he had received. Each piece of correspondence was part of a broader web he wove around the realm, forging new alliances, pressuring old enemies, coaxing houses into acceptance or at least silence. Everything was precarious. One misstep could lead to a fresh rebellion, or to Daenerys reigniting the city with the single word Dracarys. Tyrion exhaled. It softly. He had orchestrated so much of this war, but he could not fully predict how Daenerys' grief and anger might surge if threatened. Davos cleared his throat. "I came to discuss ships, if it please you. The Queen's war galleys are still anchored in Blackwater Bay, and many of them require repairs. Half those ships took damage from Euron Greyjoy's scorpions." "Of course." Tyrion gestured for Davos to continue. "What do you propose?" "We'll need more timbers from the north," Davos said. "We can negotiate with the lords around the Wolfswood or the tall trees in Bear Island, but that means coin. The crown's coffers aren't brimming, and no one wants to pay for more war. But if we're to keep the seas secure, we need a fleet that can deter pirates or rebels." Tyrion thought of the Iron Bank's ledgers and the precarious finances of the realm. Daenerys, enthroned as she was, had incinerated half the city that paid the taxes. Then again, Tyrion had begun to glean coin from other sources, Dorne, Essos, and trade tariffs that could be quietly imposed on certain shipping lanes. He pursed his lips. "We'll find the funds. I'll see to it." Grey Worm, who had been silent, said, "If the Iron Islands or any other house tries to challenge us by sea, we cannot be unprepared." Tyrion nodded. "Precisely. Consider it done, Ser Davos. The letters will go out today to the northern lords requesting the timbers we need." He crossed to the table, scanning the papers. Davos studied him. "How fares the realm's acceptance of the Queen?" It was a delicate question that hung between them like a loaded crossbow. Tyrion decided on honesty, or at least the half-truth. "Dorne is quiet but wary. The Vale is currently neutral, leaning on the fact that they lost many men defending the north against the dead. We're still negotiating the exact terms of their homage. The Reach Lords, well, they're in disarray. Many resent how the fields of the Reach were ravaged. For now, they've sent envoys who talk about harvests, taxes, and restitution. If we can keep the food supply stable, they might remain docile. The Westerlands, what's left of my family's territory, has no real leadership. The gold mines are nearly empty, and their loyalty to House Lannister died with Cersei. But they dislike Targaryens, so we'll see if they remain obedient or rise in protest. In short, the realm is ours on paper, but every corner needs coaxing." Davos sighed. "Not surprising. And the north?" Tyrion allowed a mild shrug, aware that the subject of the north was complicated by more than politics. Jon Snow had left King's Landing shortly after Daenerys claimed it, seeking to help reorder the north and bury those who fell against the White Walkers. No one knew for certain if he would ever return. Tyrion considered how that departure had affected Daenerys's mood in the aftermath of her bloody conquest, how it might yet shape alliances if Jon chose to remain aloof. "The North is declared loyal," Tyrion said carefully. "They remember Daenerys's role in the Long Night, and they respect her power. But they are content to remain apart for as long as possible. Sansa Stark, Queen in the North, as some call her, has indicated no intention of bending the knee again. So we stand on a delicate precipice. The Queen is not pleased with the idea of a separate Northern Kingdom, but so far she's allowed it, perhaps because she knows an immediate conflict would be ill-advised. Or perhaps," he added with a faint, calculating smile, "she still holds out hope that Jon Snow will persuade Sansa to see reason." Grey Worm's jaw tightened. "If the North does not submit, that is an insult. We can march on Winterfell. Destroy it if necessary." Tyrion met his gaze. "We can," he agreed softly, "but it would be unwise. The armies are tired. The people of King's Landing are terrified. Another open war might unite all of Westeros against us. We need to mend these wounds, not tear them open." For a moment, Grey Worm said nothing. Then his rigid posture eased by a fraction. "I will speak to the Queen on this matter." Davos cleared his throat gently. "And so you shall. In the meantime, I'll make arrangements for the ships. I'll need a letter bearing the Queen's seal, so the northern houses know it's official." Tyrion glanced at the nearest quill, considering how easy it was to create illusions with a bit of ink on parchment. He had done so 1,000 times, sometimes forging entire arcs of destiny with a single signature. "I'll see to the letter immediately," he said. "A raven will leave by midday." Davos nodded. "Then I'll be off to the harbor to survey the ships myself." Tyrion thanked him, watching Davos depart with the measured step of a man who had once smuggled onions, but now navigated a labyrinth of politics. As the door shut, Tyrion turned his attention to Grey Worm. The commander's eyes were distant. Tyrion suspected Grey Worm still wrestled with the memory of Missandei's execution at Cersei's hands, an act that had helped ignite Daenerys's rage. There was little Tyrion could do to soothe that grief, other than to keep forging illusions that might prevent further bloodshed. He placed a hand lightly on a piece of parchment, half hoping Grey Worm would go. But Grey Worm did not move. After a silent moment, he said, "When the Queen returns, she will ask for your report. Best you have it ready." Tyrion inclined his head. "I'll prepare it," he said. Grey Worm took one final glance at him and left. Tyrion exhaled and sank into a chair at the table. The flicker of torchlight against the stone walls reminded him of those nights beneath the Red Keep, back when he'd first learned the power of small messages, small manipulations. Even now, with Daenerys enthroned, he was weaving new threads into his tapestry. But the tapestry, he admitted, was marred by scorch marks, unanticipated horrors that had overshadowed his carefully orchestrated illusions. He reached for a quill and dipped it in ink, scanning the piles of letters. Many were from lords across the realm. Requests for aid, protests about taxes, pleas for justice. In each petition, Tyrion saw potential angles to tighten or relax Daenerys's hold. If the crown was merciful in one region, it might quell thoughts of rebellion. If it was firm or harsh in another, it might instill fear that prevented open defiance. Balance, Tyrion reminded himself. He had to maintain the realm's precarious balance. If Daenerys felt threatened, she might unleash her dragon again, and all illusions of a stable peace would vanish in a tide of screams and fire. He began drafting a letter to the Manderly family in White Harbor, addressing the matter of needed timber for ship repairs. He complimented Lord Manderly's generosity and reminded him that if the Crown's ships patrolled the waters near White Harbor, trade would flourish. He hinted at future alliances, vague enough to avoid commitments but enticing enough to ensure Manderly's cooperation. Then he scratched out the final lines, pausing to choose a closing that suggested Daenerys's power without stoking fear. Such subtleties could make the difference between compliance and revolt. Once done, he moved on to a letter addressed to the new Prince of Dorne, one of the Martell cousins who had survived the brutal travails of the last few years. Tyrion explained how King's Landing required supplies of fresh fruit and wine, how the crown was prepared to pay or trade certain privileges. The letter included subtle reminders that Dorne historically valued its independence, and that Daenerys was a queen who might allow a greater measure of Dornish self-rule if the region cooperated. All illusions within illusions, but illusions Tyrion hoped would keep swords sheathed. At length, he heard distant footsteps approaching. He recognized them as Daenerys's, light, purposeful, decisive. He set his quill aside and rose just as the door opened. Daenerys swept into the room, her silver-gold hair still slightly windswept, the dark leather of her clothing bearing traces of ash. She smelled faintly of smoke and the crisp winter air that had never fully departed the city since the onslaught of the final winter months. "Tyrion," she said, voice echoing just a bit in the hollowed confines of the chamber. "I've seen the city walls. The repairs are acceptable, but the people, they look at me with dread." Her tone held a plaintive edge, and Tyrion approached carefully. She might have flown over the city with the best intentions, to show her presence, to quell rumors of any immediate uprising. But all the people saw was the silhouette of the conqueror who had burned thousands. "They fear what they do not understand," Tyrion said softly. "They've been under Lannister rule for years, and before that, Baratheons, Targaryens, a tangled web of successors. You are something new, your grace. Give them time." She studied him. "Time, yes, but how many generations must pass before they realize I mean to protect them?" "Fewer generations if we show mercy and stability now," Tyrion replied. "Rebuilding is the clearest signal of your intent. Once they see that you bring more than dragonfire, they might learn to hope again." Her eyes flicked to the parchments on the table. "These letters, are they all requests?" "Most," Tyrion said. "Some are proposals, some are demands. We must address them carefully, so no region feels neglected or singled out." Daenerys stepped forward, selecting a random parchment. She glanced over its lines, mouth tightening. "The name here, House Meadows from Grassfield Keep, in the Reach. They claim my unsullied patrols are too harsh, that they harass travelers on the roads." Tyrion nodded. "I read that. Likely an exaggeration, but we can dispatch a small group to investigate and ensure no real misconduct is happening. If we discover any wrongdoing, we punish it swiftly. That demonstrates your justice." She placed the parchment aside. "Do it, then. Send someone we trust." "I will," Tyrion promised. "Would you like me to read through each request and summarize them for you now? Or wait until the full council meets?" Daenerys pressed her lips together in thought. "Wait for the council. Have them convene by midday. I want Grey Worm, Ser Davos, and any other key advisors present. We'll handle them all at once." Tyrion inclined his head. "As you wish." He sensed her agitation, so he decided to broach a topic that might soothe her, if only slightly. "My queen, might I suggest you tour the newly constructed shelters near Flea Bottom tomorrow? We've established quartering for refugees from the war. Let them see you speak with them. Could show your compassionate side." Daenerys paused, as if uncertain. Her mouth parted, and Tyrion thought he glimpsed sorrow in her eyes. "Would they not see me as the reason they're in shelters to begin with?" He faced her gently. "Some might, but the fact remains that they live, thanks to the relief we're bringing in. People are hungry for hope. If you appear before them, unarmored, and talk of rebuilding, you can inspire something other than fear." For a moment, her gaze dropped, and she let out a breath that seemed weighed down by regret. Then she raised her head, chin tilting. "Yes, tomorrow then. Make sure it's arranged." Tyrion said nothing further, only offered a small, respectful nod. He recognized that the nightmares of her conquest hovered like a shadow behind her every step. She had achieved what she wanted, the Iron Throne, but at a terrible cost that still haunted her. Keeping her anchored, keeping her from succumbing entirely to the bitterness of betrayal and the taste of vengeance, remained Tyrion's greatest test. Once, he had believed Daenerys might be a perfect queen. Now, he understood that perfect queens did not exist, only flawed rulers who had to be shaped by counsel and illusions. With their immediate tasks set, Daenerys left him to finalize the letters. Tyrion watched her go, noticing her shoulders were stiff, her steps certain but tired. When the door closed, he resumed his seat and drew forth another sheet of parchment. He had a more private message to compose, coded instructions for an agent he had in the Iron Islands. Though Yara Greyjoy was nominally loyal to Daenerys, the Iron Islands had never been easy to tame. Tyrion intended to sow the seeds of caution there, ensuring no restive lord or petty captain found the courage to declare open defiance. The illusions had to span from corner to corner of the realm. Only then could he keep it from fracturing. Only then could he steer Daenerys' rule away from further massacre and, perhaps, guide the realm into something better. He began to write, carefully encoding each line. It was a code he had refined over the years, deriving half from the simple ciphers Baelish had once employed and half from new flourishes that only Tyrion and a handful of confidants understood. The message read as mundane instructions about grain shipments and fishing rights, but hidden within its shapes were commands. Keep watch on the captains who question their allegiance. Bribe them or threaten them if necessary. Do not let them unite under a banner of rebellion. The illusions must hold. The door swung open again before he finished. This time, it was a young page in Targaryen livery, face flushed from running. "My Lord Hand," he panted. "A man claiming to be from the stormlands is here to see you. He bears an urgent letter from his lord." "Which lord?" Tyrion asked, not looking up from his parchment. He says Lord Tarth sent him. Something about raiders along the coast. He demands an audience." Tyrion set aside his quill. "Very well. Send him in." He regarded the coded letter, deciding to fold it away for now. Another day, another complaint, another chance to calm roiling waters. A sturdy man in a travel-stained cloak stepped in. He held out a scroll with a broken seal that bore the sigil of House Tarth, a quartered field of yellow suns and white crescents. His expression was tense, his hair damp with sweat or perhaps sea spray. "Lord Hand," he said, voice rough, "I came as quick as I could. Lord Tarth begs the Queen's assistance. He says raiders have been harrying the coast, burning small villages along Shipbreaker Bay." Tyrion extended a hand, and the man gave him the letter. Breaking the wax, Tyrion scanned its contents. Lord Tarth described swift attacks by men who might be sell-sales or pirates. They struck at night, stole supplies, left villages smoking. Lord Tarth lacked the men to repel them, since so many had died in the wars. He pleaded for the crown's immediate intervention. Tyrion's mind danced with possibilities. Could this be the beginning of a rebellion? Or merely opportunistic raiders sensing weakness in a fractured realm? He set down the letter, regarding the messenger with a sympathetic nod. "These raiders, do you have any notion of their origin?" "They fly no banners," the messenger replied. "But some survivors claim they saw men wearing bits of old Baratheon colors. Others say they heard talk of Sellsword companies from Essos. We aren't certain." Tyrion drummed his fingers on the table. "Very well. We shall send men to investigate. You must be weary after your journey. Wait outside, and I will make arrangements." The man bowed, relief momentarily easing the grim lines of his face. "Thank you, my Lord Hand." He backed out as the page held the door. Tyrion let out a breath when he was gone. Another spark that could flare into an inferno if not contained. The realm was dotted with such sparks. Petty lords, disillusioned soldiers, ex-mercenaries. War's end did not mean peace for all. Some thrived on chaos. He took a moment to consider what force he could spare. The Unsullied were stretched thin, maintaining order in King's Landing and patrolling roads from here to the Rose Road. The Dothraki, those who remained, were not well suited for naval engagements or coastal raids. Ser Davos might organize a small flotilla, or they could dispatch a contingent of soldiers from the Crownlands. But manpower was painfully low. Tyrion decided to speak with Grey Worm about a measured response, enough to deter the raiders without depleting the city's defenses. Rising, he made his way toward the corridor. The flicker of torches played along the battered walls, as though mocking the illusions of grandeur the Red Keep once boasted. Down a winding staircase, He emerged into a courtyard partially open to the sky. Piles of rubble still stood in one corner, yet the rest had been cleared to create a training ground. There, a group of unsullied sparred silently, their spears whirling in disciplined arcs. Tyrion spotted Grey Worm observing, arms folded over his chest. "Commander," Tyrion began, approaching at an even pace. The clang of metal on metal punctuated each breath. A messenger arrived from Tarth. Coastal raids, villages burned, urgent request for help. Grey Worm's posture tensed. "Which men shall we send?" "That's what I came to discuss," Tyrion said. "We need to respond, but the city can't be left bare." Grey Worm stepped closer, voice low. "I will send 50 unsullied, enough to defend Tarth and crush raiders. They will bring discipline. The Queen wants order in every corner of the realm." Tyrion considered. 50 might be too few if the raiders were numerous, but too many if Tarth needed only a show of strength. "Will that suffice?" Grey Worm's eyes were hard. "The unsullied who remain are the best. 50 should suffice to hold the coastline until we determine the size of the threat." Tyrion nodded, relenting. "Very well. I'll arrange the ships to carry them. Ser Davos is at the docks and can coordinate. Inform the Queen, let her know we're taking action, and see if she wants to add anything." Grey Worm didn't respond verbally, only gave a terse nod. Tyrion turned to go, but paused as an afterthought struck him. "Commander, about the city guard. I've noticed the men in gold cloaks." "Not gold cloaks," Grey Worm interjected. "They wear new colors now, the red and black." "Right," Tyrion said, chewing his lip. "Some of them were once Lannister guards. They may not be entirely loyal to the Queen. I'd advise removing any we can't trust. Replace them with new recruits who have sworn fealty to Daenerys." Grey Worm inclined his head. "We will investigate them." "I appreciate it." Tyrion turned away, heading toward the archway that led deeper into the keep. In truth, the reformed City Watch was still a tapestry of uncertain loyalties. Many had served under Robert, Joffrey, even Cersei. Others were sellswords seeking an easy coin. Some might harbor hidden grudges. Tyrion wanted to ensure no infiltration could threaten Daenerys or, more importantly, threaten the illusions holding the realm together. If any guard were to discover how thoroughly Tyrion had shaped the conflict, how he continued to manipulate the flow of letters and counsel to maintain a precarious power, they could cause irreparable harm. He comforted himself with the thought that few suspected him of such large-scale cunning. Most believed Tyrion was simply a sly politician, not the realm's secret architect. He re-entered the corridors, stepping around a missing chunk of floor where dragonfire had blasted through. The memory of that day still haunted him, but regrets could not undo what had happened. Tyrion inhaled a steadying breath and climbed another stair to a hallway that led to his private rooms. He took care with the coded parchment he carried. Once inside his modest chamber, he locked the door behind him. The room was sparsely furnished. A bed, a table, a small hearth, and a tall, battered cabinet for clothes and effects. Tyrion crossed to the table where a single candle flickered. He unrolled the coded message once more and finished composing it. When satisfied, he sprinkled sand to dry the ink, folded the parchment carefully, and sealed it with a wax stamp. The stamp bore a subtle mark resembling a broken lion's head, an emblem known only to a select few as belonging to Tyrion's personal network. Then he moved to a loose stone in the wall, carefully prying it aside. Behind it lay a hidden recess where he stored delicate letters and coded notes. He placed the sealed parchment inside for now. It would be dispatched that evening by a trusted courier who believed he was simply delivering a message about fish quotas. Tyrion replaced the stone, satisfied. Another thread woven in the tapestry, one that would keep the realm from unraveling. Or so he hoped. Outside his narrow window, the clouds shifted, revealing a paler sun. The day was only half gone, but Tyrion felt as if he had lived through an entire war already. He sank onto the edge of his bed for a moment, letting his mind wander. He thought of Jaime, his brother, whose final fate lay buried in the rubble of the Red Keep, if rumors were true. Tyrion had never found Jaime's body, nor Cersei's. The last anyone saw, they were beneath collapsing masonry in the dungeons. Sometimes he entertained the impossible notion that Jaime had found a way out, as he had so many times before. But no, the odds were minuscule. Grief flickered in Tyrion's chest, mingling with an old, tired anger at Cersei, at Tywin, at the ghosts of House Lannister. He closed his eyes, remembering how, as a child, he had tried so hard to prove himself. Now, ironically, he had proven himself far beyond what Tywin ever imagined. But the proof was couched in secret manipulations and the knowledge that he, in his own way, had orchestrated the destruction of House Lannister's power. A knock at the door stirred him. He rose, crossing to open it. The page from earlier stood there. "My Lord Hand, the midday council meeting is ready." Tyrion nodded. "Very good. I'm on my way." He slipped out of the room, ensuring the door locked behind him. The page guided him through the corridors to the same council chamber where he had begun the day. There, Daenerys sat at the head of the table, Grey Worm at her side, Davos on her other, and a handful of lesser advisors Tyrion had deemed useful for reconstruction efforts. Tyrion took his seat, smoothing his doublet. Daenerys's expression was carefully neutral, yet Tyrion caught the tension around her eyes. She was bracing for the cascade of requests and complaints. The meeting began with Davos's update on the ships. Tyrion listened carefully, offering clarifications when needed. Daenerys inquired about how soon the vessels could be repaired, whether the taxes levied for naval improvements would strain local lords. Tyrion answered politely, explaining the letters he had prepared for the Manderleys and others. That matter handled, they moved on to Lord Tarth's plea. Grey Worm shared the plan to send 50 Unsullied, traveling by sea to repel the raiders. Daenerys approved, though she demanded a swift response to avoid more villages falling to flame. Next came the stack of letters Tyrion had read, each containing a new woe or petition. A subtle dance commenced. Tyrion would read out a complaint. Daenerys would consider it. The council would offer suggestions. He noted the shift in her tone when confronted with certain demands. If a letter described a house that had once fought against her, she instinctively leaned toward severity. Tyrion did his best to steer her to moderation, reminding her that the realm was weary. In some cases, she acquiesced to his reasoning. In others, she insisted on a stern show of force. By the end, they had hammered out decisions on everything from disputes over farmland near the Rose Road to the question of tariffs on cargo ships arriving from Bravos. As the meeting drew to a close, Daenerys settled her hands on the table. "One last matter," she said. "The question of Sansa Stark and the North. We have not heard from Winterfell in weeks. Do we have any new letters?" Tyrion shook his head. "Not since the one proclaiming Sansa's gratitude for your role in the war against the dead and reaffirming the North's independence. She has not responded to our invitation to visit King's Landing." A flicker of anger crossed Daenerys's features. "She insults me." Tyrion understood the sting. Daenerys had lost almost everything to achieve the throne, and now the North believed it could simply stand apart. "She's cautious," Tyrion said carefully. "The Northerners have never warmed to Southern rulers. You knew this from the start." Daenerys's gaze turned icy. "I will not let the North remain a separate kingdom forever. When the realm is stable, they will have to kneel." Perhaps, Tyrion agreed. But pressing them now could spark rebellion from others who might support the North's cause. Best to let time and the promise of mutual benefit bring them to heel. Daenerys paused, then nodded stiffly. "Very well. For now, we let it lie." She scanned the faces around the table. "If there is no more pressing business?" No one spoke. Davos shifted in his seat. Grey Worm stared at some distant point. The other advisors cast their eyes down. Daenerys rose. "Council is dismissed." They stood as she swept out. Tyrion could sense a collective exhalation in the room. Serving as Daenerys's council had grown fraught with tension. Ever since the day she burned King's Landing, there was an undercurrent of fear. Yet the realm desperately needed governance, so they soldiered on. One by one, the advisors drifted away, returning to their tasks. Tyrion lingered, collecting the parchments into a neat pile. He intended to glean any final bits of information from them before handing them off to scribes for official documentation. As he tidied, Ser Davos approached quietly. "Mind if I have a word, my Lord Hand?" Tyrion looked up. "Of course, Ser Davos." Davos glanced at the departing figures, ensuring they were alone. I wonder how you see all this. The Queen's grip on the city, her demeanor since the war. Do you think she'll settle into a just rule?" Tyrion weighed his answer. He remembered how Davos had once served Stannis Baratheon, a man with his own brand of zealotry that ended in tragedy. Davos had seen too many false kings and illusions of power. "I think," Tyrion said carefully, "that the Queen has the capacity for justice, but she's been wounded by betrayal and by the losses she's suffered. She needs the right guidance, the right environment, to show her better instincts." Davos's lips flattened. "I saw the city burn. Forgive me if I remain uneasy." Tyrion sighed softly. "We're all uneasy, Ser Davos, but we do what we can. If you wish to see fewer flames in the future, remain close to the Queen. Offer your counsel. She's more likely to heed the voices she trusts." Davos nodded, though doubt lingered in his expression. He thanked Tyrion and left the chamber. Tyrion was alone with the scattered papers, the quiet hush of a realm in fragile reconstruction. He realized that Davos's concerns mirrored many. Fear did not vanish simply because the war ended. It settled into the corners, ready to pounce if another crisis arose. Tyrion's illusions, however carefully built, could only do so much if Daenerys fell to her darker impulses. He left the chamber and spent the afternoon coordinating the dispatch of Unsullied to Tarth, finalizing trade details with a Braavosi envoy, and reviewing proposals for new city gates, ones that might incorporate Targaryen symbolism. Late in the day, as the sun dipped and an orange glow crept through windows that remained intact, Tyrion paused outside a smaller audience hall. He heard voices within, Daenerys speaking with someone in low, intense tones. A thread of curiosity tugged at him. Instead of barging in, he stepped closer, listening. The heavy door muffled words, but he caught fragments. "Can't keep quiet if the North rallies." Daenerys's voice clipped. A male voice answered, "Possibly Grey Worms. Must respond swiftly, show strength." Tyrion leaned back, setting his jaw. He suspected the topic was the same. The North's independence, Sansa's stance. The conversation ended abruptly. The door opened, and Grey Worm emerged, halting at the sight of Tyrion. "My Lord Hand," he said, clearly surprised. Tyrion nodded. "Commander." Inside, Daenerys's voice said, "Let him in, Grey Worm." Stepping aside, the commander let Tyrion enter. Daenerys stood near a table with an old tapestry, the corners stained by smoke. She regarded Tyrion with a measured look. "You were listening?" "Only by chance," Tyrion replied, not bothering to pretend ignorance. "Is there something more urgent about the North?" Daenerys pressed her lips together. Grey Worm reports that some scouts in the Riverlands say the Northern Lords have been spotted traveling south, armed for war, if rumors are to be believed. Tyrion's brows knit. "Any reason to think they're coming here?" "They could be heading to Harrenhal or to Moat Cailin," she said. "But the timing troubles me." Sansa's silence, now this. "Have you received no letters at all?" "None," Tyrion affirmed. "But rumor is not proof. We don't want to act on hearsay." Daenerys's expression hardened. "If the North is preparing for conflict, I'll not wait for them to catch me unawares." Tyrion measured his words. "A show of force from us could provoke the very conflict we seek to avoid. Let me send ravens to Winterfell, politely inquiring about these troop movements. If Sansa is planning something, she'll have to respond. And if she does not?" Daenerys asked coldly. "Then we prepare," Tyrion said. "But let's not leap to fire and sword over a rumor. You'll earn more trust if you attempt diplomacy first." She studied him, eyes flickering in the wan light. "Very well, send your ravens, but do it swiftly, and ensure they convey that if the North truly plans any aggression, I will not hesitate to unleash Drogon upon them." Tyrion bowed his head slightly. "I will do so, your grace." He turned to leave, but Daenerys's voice stopped him. "Tyrion," she said more softly, "why do you suppose Sansa hates me so?" He glanced back, seeing genuine conflict in her eyes. Once upon a time, Daenerys had believed people would flock to her cause. Her dream of breaking the wheel had not included the possibility that others might see her as just another tyrant. Sansa is protective of her home. She's seen too many kings and queens devour the North's resources, kill its people, or break promises. She doesn't know you the way I do. Daenerys's jaw tightened. Then perhaps she should come and learn. She might in time, Tyrion said, though he doubted it. Let the ravens fly first. Daenerys dismissed him with a curt nod. Tyrion left, weaving through corridors that were ghostly quiet. The illusions were fragile. If the North truly marched, they could spark a final war that would rip the realm apart. Tyrion did not want that. He had seen enough blood spilled to last a dozen lifetimes, and if Daenerys unleashed Drogon again, the city would never recover from another wave of terror. He needed to quell this potential conflict quickly. That evening, by the meager light of an oil lamp, Tyrion penned the letters to Winterfell. He kept his tone cordial but firm. The Crown has heard rumors of northern troop movements. We hope these are merely drills or defensive measures. The Queen would welcome reassurance that the North has no hostile intent. At the same time, he wrote a coded letter to an agent he kept near White Harbor, instructing them to investigate any movement of troops from the North. Confirm or deny the rumor, discreetly. We must have clarity. Tyrion sealed both letters. The first bore Daenerys's official seal, the second bore the small broken lion stamp. Then he entrusted them to two separate couriers, each bound for different routes north. He prayed at least one would return with the truth. Days passed in a swirl of administrative tasks, small crises, and uneasy quiet. The contingent of Unsullied departed for Tarth, loaded onto battered ships that Davos oversaw. The city's reconstruction advanced in fits and starts, with stonemasons bickering over wages and supply lines occasionally disrupted by bandits. Daenerys made her appearance in Flea Bottom, as Tyrion suggested, distributing bread and speaking haltingly with the refugees. Some were moved to tears, others trembled in fear. A few spat curses behind her back. But the sight of her soared through the city's gossip circles, softened by the rumor that the Queen did not appear in armor or with her dragon overhead. It was a small step, but a step nonetheless. Tyrion continued to craft illusions through letters. He wrote to the Iron Bank, praising their faith in the Crown's ability to repay debts. He wrote to the Vale, suggesting trade incentives if they recognized Daenerys's authority. He cultivated the notion that each region had more to gain from working with the Crown than opposing it. Meanwhile, he quietly arranged for certain lords who showed hints of defiance to be visited by envoys carrying carefully veiled threats. Better a subtle intimidation than a spectacle of fire and blood. His biggest worry remained the North. Weeks dragged on, and no ravens returned from Winterfell, nor from his agent near White Harbor. Daenerys grew restless, her patience wearing thin. Grey Worm began training additional men in King's Landing. Reports from the Riverlands remained inconclusive. Some travelers claimed to have seen a northern host on the move, others scoffed at the idea. The tension in the air was palpable. Tyrion found himself losing sleep, haunted by the possibility of a northern rebellion. If that happened, Daenerys might decide to lay waste to Winterfell, repeating King's Landing's horror. One crisp morning, as Tyrion paced near the Red Keep's charred courtyard, a breathless messenger found him. "My Lord Hand," the young man called, carrying a small scroll case. This arrived from the north. Tyrion's heart skipped. Finally, he took the case, stepping aside to open it. Inside was a thin scrap of parchment bearing the seal of House Stark, a direwolf's head on pale wax. He opened it hastily, scanning the contents. "Lord Hand, reports of the North must be exaggerated. We have not dispatched any large force south. Some small groups of our bannermen traveled to the Trident for trade. If you hear otherwise, it is rumor. Lady Sansa Stark. Tyrion exhaled in relief. So the dreaded troop movement might be no more than traveling merchants or a handful of soldiers. Daenerys would be placated to know the North was not openly marching for war. But then Tyrion noted that the parchment was short, almost perfunctory. No mention of courtesy or bridging differences, no acknowledgement of independence either. It was less an olive branch and more an irritated clarification. He rolled it up, deciding this was, for now, the best news they could hope for. He found Daenerys in the throne room, a shadow of its former splendor, the floor marred by blackened cracks, the windows still partially boarded. She stood near the shattered remains of the Iron Throne, which Drogon's fire had twisted and partially melted, though enough jagged swords remained for her to claim it as a seat. In truth, she seldom sat upon it. Today she was pacing, pausing to listen to Grey Worm's report about city patrols. Tyrion approached, clearing his throat. Daenerys turned. "My Lord Hand?" she asked, an undertone of impatience. He held up the scroll. "A raven from Winterfell at last. Lady Sansa states the North has not deployed a large force." Daenerys took the parchment, her eyes flicking over it quickly. "She offers no explanation beyond that? Only that any rumor of a northern army is just that, a rumor." Daenerys studied Sansa's signature, expression tight. "We hear no apology for ignoring my previous letters, no acknowledgement of my rule over the realm. Just denial." "It would seem so," Tyrion said gently, "but it's a denial that implies they are not preparing for war. This is good news, Your Grace." Grey Worm's stance shifted, uneasy. Or it could be a lie. Tyrion knew that possibility lingered. Sansa Stark was no fool. She understood the power of misinformation. "We can't discount it," he said, "but it matches the incomplete reports we have from travelers. Perhaps we can believe her, at least for now." Daenerys let out a breath, the tension in her shoulders easing a fraction. "Very well. We'll treat it as truth unless we learn otherwise. Commander, maintain current readiness." Tyrion drafted a reply, a polite response, but note that we expect more communication in the future. Make it clear we will not tolerate further slights. Tyrion inclined his head, relieved that she was not leaping to aggression. "As you wish." He dared a small, careful smile. "This may be the first step in thawing relations." Daenerys scoffed softly. "We shall see. The North is as cold in heart as in climate." She turned away, gazing at the battered walls, perhaps recalling the day she had seized King's Landing. Tyrion could almost sense her recalling the rush of power that came from Dragonfire. He hoped the North's letter would keep her from resorting to that power again. He stole a glance at Grey Worm, who remained silent as a statue, gaze unwavering. Tyrion murmured a polite goodbye and withdrew to compose the letter Daenerys requested. Despite this minor reprieve, Tyrion felt the fragile weight of the illusions he balanced. With each day that Daenerys did not burn another city, the realm inched closer to acceptance. But acceptance did not guarantee loyalty, nor did it quell old grudges. He had to continue weaving alliances, checking potential threats, ensuring the crown's finances did not collapse. Step by step, the realm crawled toward stability, never fully safe from a sudden spark of conflict. Weeks turned into months. The war-torn city replaced rubble with fresh mortar, though scars remained visible everywhere. Blackened stone in the alleyways, half-rebuilt towers leaning precariously, orphaned children begging on street corners. Tyrion oversaw new legislation. Improved roads, the clearing of wreckage, the establishment of an orphanage funded by the crown. A gesture Daenerys made to prove her compassion, though Tyrion had suggested it. Farmers returned to the crownlands to plant after the devastation. The Iron Bank extended a cautious loan, swayed by Tyrion's negotiations and the prospect of new trade deals. These shifts did not erase the horrors, but they gave the people a semblance of routine. Daenerys showed glimpses of her old self, meeting with commoners in a refurbished courtyard, hearing petitions, showing mercy where it would do the most good. Still, she could be stern, especially toward those lords who had once raised arms against her. More than once, Tyrion found himself intervening when she threatened harsh punishments, urging her to consider the realm's need for unity. Sometimes she listened. Sometimes she dismissed him, reminding him that she was the Dragon Queen. Each time, Tyrion accepted her anger with bowed head, quietly ensuring that illusions of fair rule persisted. In those months, certain houses bent the knee more openly. The Tarly remnants in the Reach, House Mutton in the Riverlands, and a handful of lesser lords in the Westerlands. With each oath of fealty, Daenerys's hold strengthened. But Tyrion never forgot that an oath forced by fear could be broken in a moment of opportunity. The realm's Aki. Tance was still shallow, like frost on a pond that might crack under too much weight. One evening, Tyrion paced in his chamber, a goblet of wine in hand, waiting for a knock he expected. Sure enough, a discreet tap sounded at the door. He opened it to admit a wiry man with a hood drawn over his face. The man's boots were dusty from travel, and a faint scar curved along his jaw. This was Forley, one of Tyrion's most valued informants, someone who had worked the underbelly of King's Landing long before the war. Forley slid inside, glancing around nervously. Tyrion closed the door. "You have something for me?" Forley reached into his cloak and withdrew a folded parchment. "Word from the Vale, from one of your ciphers. It might be important." Tyrion took it, unfurling it under the candlelight. The writing was coded, but Tyrion could parse it quickly, having devised the cipher himself. Rumors swirl that a faction in the Vale contemplates backing Sansa Stark if she seeks a separate kingdom. They fear the Dragon Queen's unpredictability. No concrete moves yet, but watchful eyes remain on the north. Some Vale lords are more open to Targaryen rule if given trade advantages. A flicker of concern passed through Tyrion's mind. The Vale had remained relatively unscathed, preserving their fighting strength. If they sided with the North against Daenerys, a powerful alliance could emerge. "Thank you, Forley," Tyrion said, folding the parchment. "Any other news?" Forley hesitated. "Just talk in the streets that House Lannister is cursed. Some blame you, some blame the Queen. Folk say the city might never recover from the blood spilled." Tyrion let out a quiet sigh. Cities recover given time if they're allowed the chance. It's rumors. Let them talk. Spread a counter-rumor that the Crown is offering new opportunities for merchants, that will see prosperity soon. The man nodded, accepting the subtle instruction. Tyrion gave him a small purse of coins. Forley bowed and slipped out as quietly as he'd come. Tyrion tossed back a gulp of wine, tasting its bitterness. He realized that no matter how hard he worked to erect illusions of benevolence and stability, the realm's memory of the war would persist. People would always whisper that the Targaryens had unleashed fire, that the Lannisters had orchestrated chaos. In part, they were correct. Tyrion had orchestrated more than they knew. But if he was going to keep Daenerys on the throne without further massacres, he needed to outmaneuver these grumblings in the Vale. He dropped into a chair, rereading the coded note. A faction in the Vale contemplates backing Sansa Stark. So far, Sansa had made no move for open rebellion, but the possibility lingered that if enough lords supported her, she might challenge Daenerys from the north and the Vale simultaneously. Perhaps Sansa wasn't ignoring the realm. Perhaps she was quietly forging alliances. Tyrion felt a pang of respect for her cunning. She had learned well in King's Landing, just as he had taught her certain lessons before everything turned dark. What to do? If he told Daenerys of these rumors, she might react with a show of force that would confirm every fear the Vale had. But if Tyrion kept it secret and it grew into an actual alliance, the realm could plunge into war again. He needed a middle approach. Perhaps he could sow division among the Vale lords, offering some a place at Daenerys' court, others trade privileges, ensuring they could never unite behind Sansa. If they remained fractured, any potential alliance with the North would falter. Tyrion set the parchment aside, then opened a blank page. He began writing, "To the Lord of House Royce, I trust your house flourishes in these post-war days." He carefully crafted a letter praising Lord Royce's loyalty during the battle against the dead, reminding him how Daenerys had saved the North and, by extension, the Vale. He hinted that should Royce wish to deepen ties with the crown, certain privileges could be arranged. An advantageous marriage for his kin, perhaps, or the right to impose tariffs on goods passing from the Vale into the Riverlands. Every line was an illusion designed to drive a wedge between Royce and any northern sympathies. Tyrion would repeat this tactic with other influential Vale houses. House Grafton, House Corbray, House Waynwood. Each letter would be crafted to appeal to their specific hopes or fears. Divide and conquer without a drop of blood spilled, if possible. He spent half the night penning these letters, sealing them with the Queen's official sigil. Then he penned additional coded instructions to his network in the Vale, directing them to spread rumors that House Royce already planned to bend the knee wholeheartedly. Whether true or not, it might sow suspicion among those lords considering an alliance with the North. By the time the candle had burned low, Tyrion felt a sense of grim satisfaction. He might yet stave off rebellion with such illusions. And in the morning, Daenerys would be none the wiser, only noticing that the Vale had grown more cooperative. When he finally extinguished the candle and sank onto his bed, the weight of sleep pressed hard on him. In the darkness, he wondered if this would be his fate until his last breath. Forever weaving letters, bribes, lies, alliances, all to keep the realm from imploding. He had manipulated events to bring about this new order. Now he was trapped in its maintenance. Sometimes he resented it. Other times, he embraced it as a cosmic jest upon House Lannister, that the disdained dwarf had become the puppet master of kings and queens. The next day was a tapestry of routine. Tyrion delivered a progress report to Daenerys, oversaw the dispatch of letters to the Vale, held an audience with merchants from Lys, and shared a terse lunch with Grey Worm regarding city fortifications. In the afternoon, he walked among the half-ruined corridors of the Red Keep, considering how best to reconstruct them. They were symbolic. If the seat of power remained scarred, it reflected a realm still in turmoil. Stone by stone, they needed to restore the keep without erasing the memory of what had transpired. In a corridor near what had once been the royal sept, Tyrion was startled to see Jon Snow approaching. He blinked, unsure if it was truly Jon or a fleeting ghost. But there he stood, taller than Tyrion remembered, hair pulled back, wearing simple northern leathers rather than any crown or sigil. Jon inclined his head in a curt greeting. "Tyrion." "Jon," Tyrion managed, regaining his composure. "I didn't realize you'd returned to King's Landing." He glanced around, certain Daenerys had not mentioned this visit. Jon's face was grave. "We arrived at dawn. My men are outside the city, maybe 24. No grand host." He paused. "I came to speak with the Queen." Tyrion guessed the topic. The North, obviously, or perhaps Sansa's continued independence. "And does she know you're here?" Jon nodded. "I sent word ahead. I'm told I'll have an audience later today." He exhaled. "How fares the city?" Tyrion shrugged. "Healing. Slowly. Fear lingers. But there is also a sense that life must go on." Jon's dark eyes flicked to the blackened walls. "I see the marks of dragonfire remain." Tyrion nodded, uncertain what to say. He recalled how Jon had once believed Daenerys was a savior, only to witness her wrath in the final days. "She's trying," Tyrion said at last. "There is an effort to rule justly, but the realm is uneasy." Jon eyed him. "And you, Tyrion? How are you?" Tyrion let out a sound that was half laugh, half sigh. "I am occupying the same role I always have. The voice of caution, the manipulator behind the scenes, the dwarf with a quill. Surviving, if that counts." Jon nodded, though he looked pained. "It does." He studied the corridor's gloom. "I hoped the city might be different by now." Tyrion hesitated. "Wounds like these take time. Some never fully heal." Jon's expression darkened, and for a moment, Tyrion felt the old gravity of the man who had fought the dead. "Will you walk with me?" Jon asked at length. Tyrion nodded. They traversed the corridor, stepping over cracked tiles, passing arrow-slit windows that revealed courtyards below. Jon asked about the state of the council, about Grey Worm, about the City Watch. Tyrion answered with measured truth, omitting the deeper illusions he spun. Eventually, They reached a vantage point overlooking the city. From this half-shattered balcony, one could see the new rooftops patched with mismatched tiles, the scaffolding around certain towers, the labyrinthine streets. "It's not as I remember," Jon said quietly. "Though I never much liked King's Landing to begin with." Tyrion let a moment of silence pass. "You're here regarding the North, I take it." Jon nodded. "Sansa is proud. She refuses to kneel, believing it is best for the North to stand alone. Yet, winter is not truly over. We've sown crops, we've begun to rebuild. But the North could use southern aid. Trade, coin, supplies for the next winter. I came to see if the Queen might be reasonable, or if we're on the brink of war." Tyrion considered the precarious balance. If Sansa remained adamant and Daenerys demanded fealty, a clash was inevitable, unless a compromise could be found. "What do you propose?" he asked. Jon hesitated, gazing at the city. "I'm not sure. Maybe a treaty of mutual defense. The North acknowledges Daenerys' authority in matters that affect all the realm, but retains autonomy in day-to-day governance. Something like the arrangement that once existed with Dorne in the early Targaryen days." Tyrion recalled reading about that period. Dorne had only fully joined the realm decades after Aegon's conquest, under terms that granted them more self-governance. "That might be possible," Tyrion murmured. "But the Queen, she sees the North's refusal to kneel as a direct threat. You'll have to tread carefully." Jon's hand gripped the balcony rail. "Carefully, yes. I'm weary of all this. Fought the dead, fought the living, and now we stand on another precipice. Tyrion, do you believe she would burn Winterfell if we refused her?" Tyrion looked away. He could not lie outright. "I believe she's learned that fear is a powerful tool. If sufficiently provoked, she might do anything to maintain control." Jon's mouth tightened. "Then I have no choice but to reason with her. We have enough ghosts in the North already." Tyrion nodded, understanding the weight of Jon's burden. "I'll do what I can to help you persuade her, for what it's worth." "Thank you," Jon said softly, though a hint of sorrow lay behind his eyes. "I wish it hadn't come to this." "Wishes rarely match the world we live in," Tyrion said. "I've learned that many times over." They parted ways soon after, Jon going to ready himself for the audience, Tyrion heading to inform Daenerys that Jon Snow was within the city. By the time the bells tolled midday, Tyrion stood in the throne room as Daenerys ascended the battered dais. Grey Worm stood at her side, Ser Davos near the foot of the dais, and a handful of attendants and guards arrayed about. Tyrion took his place among them, waiting. Soon, Jon Snow entered, his stride purposeful, face solemn. He knelt briefly, rising to address Daenerys with the courtesy of a vassal, though no vow of fealty passed his lips. Daenerys regarded him, tension visible in her posture. "Jon Snow," she said, "you've returned after many months. Did you come to pay homage?" Jon stood straight, meeting her gaze. "I came to seek a peaceful resolution between the North and the Crown." She said nothing for a beat, scanning his face. "So the North insists on being apart. That is your definition of peace." Jon's jaw flexed. "I know how it must look from here, Your Grace. But the North has never thrived under Southern rule. We accepted you when the dead marched because we needed unity for survival. We are grateful for that. Yet the North scars run deep. If you force Sansa to kneel through fear, the resentment will poison any alliance." Daenerys' eyes flicked to Tyrion, then back to Jon. "And what do you propose as an alternative?" Jon inhaled slowly. "An arrangement that acknowledges your sovereignty over the realm's broad concerns. War, trade, major disputes, while allowing the North to govern itself. We pay tribute, we offer troops in defense of the realm when truly needed, we abide by certain laws. But day-to-day matters, taxes, local governance remain ours." Tyrion recognized the echoes of the old Dornish compromise. He silently willed Daenerys to consider it. She frowned. "Why should I allow a region to function almost as a separate kingdom while I bear the burdens of the entire realm?" Jon's expression softened. "Because you'd gain a loyal ally, not a resentful subject. and because war would cost both sides dearly. If the North is forced to bend, it might break, and you'd rule over ashes once more. A stir ran through the assembled watchers. Daenerys's face hardened at the reference to ashes, but Tyrion could see the conflict behind her eyes. She knew the horror of a city turned to cinders. She also knew the precarious hold she had on this realm. The cost of another large-scale war might be too high, no matter her appetite for power. She turned to Tyrion. "My hand, you have studied the histories. What do you say?" He stepped forward, bowing slightly. "I say, Your Grace, that if you spurn this offer, the North remains a potential flashpoint. If you accept it, you can claim the moral high ground and secure the realm's stability, at least for now. A stable realm can grow stronger, and in time, the North may see that your rule benefits them more than independence. This arrangement need not be forever." Daenerys's shoulders relaxed marginally. She turned back to Jon. "Suppose I agree. Sansa must come here, swear that she will never rebel, that she will uphold the crown's decrees when they concern the realm as a whole." Jon hesitated. She might not travel here willingly. Perhaps a neutral meeting ground, Harrenhal or Moat Cailin. "Harrenhal is close to the capital," Daenerys said sharply. "She can come there if she's too frightened of the city I burned." Jon's expression flickered. "I will speak with her. If she can be convinced, she'll come. If not, I cannot compel her, not as her brother." Daenerys drew a breath. "Then convince her. I will not have a rebellious Stark in the North. If she refuses, I'll have no choice but to see her as an enemy." Jon bowed his head. "I understand." Daenerys looked away, swirling tension in her features. Then she spoke in a softer voice. "You have risked much by coming here. See that your risk is not in vain." With that, she rose from the throne and swept out of the hall, Grey Worm at her side. The watchers exhaled collectively as the tension broke. Tyrion stepped to Jon, placing a hand on his shoulder. "That went better than it might have," he murmured. "No open threats, no talk of burning Winterfell. She's at least willing to discuss terms." Jon managed a faint nod. "I suppose that's some hope." Ser Davos approached, offering a wry smile. "I'll drink to that. Welcome back to King's Landing, lad." Jon let out a breath. "I won't stay long. I'll gather what I need and ride north. Best not to linger." Tyrion understood. The city's memories still haunted Jon, and the feeling was likely mutual. "If you need anything, let me know," Tyrion said. Jon inclined his head in thanks, then strode away, leaving Tyrion to watch his retreating back. Another piece on the board, another chance to avert war. Tyrion wondered if Sansa would be swayed. She was formidable in her own right, shaped by the horrors of the capital and the cunning of those who used to rule it. But perhaps the illusions of a partial independence might be enough. Tyrion allowed himself a tentative spark of optimism. Every new compromise, every clever arrangement, drew the realm a step further from total collapse. In the days that followed, Tyrion worked to codify the potential agreement Daenerys and Jon had discussed. He drafted documents that would allow the North certain freedoms while maintaining the crown's ultimate authority on realm-wide matters. He showed them to Daenerys, who made some minor amendments, ensuring the tribute owed from the North was substantial enough to remind them who sat on the Iron Throne. Tyrion worded everything carefully, framing it as an act of magnanimity on Daenerys's part, which might gain her respect across Westeros. A queen secure enough to grant concessions was a queen to be admired, or so the illusions would suggest. Jon departed with the documents in hand, heading north with his small retinue. Tyrion watched him go from the Red Keep's gates, wondering if Sansa would accept the offer. If she did, war might be averted. If not, Tyrion forced the thought from his mind. He preferred to dwell on the illusions he could still maintain. Meanwhile, the realm slowly, haltingly continued its recovery. The 50 Unsullied sent to Tarth had crushed the raiders there, restoring safety to that coastline. In response, Lord Tarth sent a shipment of supplies to King's Landing, praising the Queen's decisive action. The Vale Lords who received Tyrion's letters began to respond with inquiries about trade terms. suggesting they were at least open to cooperation rather than rebellion. Dorne remained aloof but quiet, content to nurse its own grievances. The Westerlands had pockets of unrest, but Tyrion encouraged Daenerys to focus on rebuilding rather than launching another campaign. Bit by bit, it appeared that the illusions of a stable monarchy were taking hold. On a night made hazy by the promise of oncoming autumn rains, Tyrion walked through King's Landing streets, flanked by a pair of unsullied guards and a few city watchmen. He wanted to see firsthand how the city dwellers fared, away from the sanitized reports. The torchlit alleys revealed a mixture of ruin and renewal. Some taverns had reopened, their lanterns glowing with subdued cheer. Vendors sold roasted nuts or spiced wine from carts. But one could still smell the aftermath of war: charred wood, lingering ash. A few beggars huddled near corners. Tyrion quietly handed out coins where he could, mindful that the Queen's generosity, however belated, needed to be seen. He stopped at a half-rebuilt sept where a small congregation prayed amid crumbling walls. A septon recognized him, bowing awkwardly. Tyrion asked about the people's needs, listened to complaints that temple alms were running low, that the faith struggled to maintain presence since the sacking of the city. Tyrion promised to speak with Daenerys about re-establishing their temple funds, though privately he knew she viewed the faith with suspicion after the High Sparrow fiasco under Cersei's reign. Still, illusions demanded that the crown support the faith enough to keep them docile. Leaving the sept, Tyrion moved on, accompanied by the patter of his guards' boots. He heard a mother calling out for her lost child, the child's name echoing in the gloom. "Talia, Talia!" A wave of sorrow seized Tyrion. War took more than lives, it shredded families. He signaled one of the watchmen to aid her. As they pressed deeper, he glimpsed the silhouette of the Red Keep on its hill, the new torchlights flickering in the battered towers. The seat of power, or so everyone believed. But power lay in illusions, in the willingness of people to believe in them. Tyrion had learned that fundamental truth long ago. Eventually, he returned to the keep, night pressing close. He parted ways with the guards and climbed a short set of stairs. A lonely parapet. There, he leaned on the rampart, overlooking the city. Tiny lights glimmered below, like scattered stars fallen to earth. The wind carried a hint of salt from Blackwater Bay, mingling with the stale scent of smoke that never fully left the air. He felt the weight of exhaustion in his limbs and the heavier weight of duty in his mind. Footsteps approached. He glanced back to see Daenerys, alone, her pale hair stirring in the breeze. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly. She shook her head. "When I do, I dream of that day, the screams, the flames. My dragons roar." She stepped up beside him, gazing at the city. "Sometimes I justify it, other times I can't." Tyrion hesitated, uncertain how to respond. "We're building a better realm now," he offered. She closed her eyes. "Am I truly? Or am I just living off fear?" "Fear and hope are not mutually exclusive," Tyrion said carefully. "Some fear you. Others hope you'll be the queen who breaks the cycle of cruelty. Your actions going forward can tilt that balance." Daenerys opened her eyes. "My father, the Mad King, once tried to burn this city. I succeeded where he failed. And now I must live with that. They say he was mad. What does that make me?" Tyrion's breath caught. It was a dangerous question, but he sensed her raw vulnerability. "You're a queen who won a terrible war, and you have the chance to use that victory for good. Few rulers can say the same." She studied the distant lights. "Do you ever regret standing by me, Tyrion?" He thought of the illusions, the manipulations, the war he had orchestrated that led them all here. Regret was too small a word for the swirl of guilt, pride, and ambition in his heart. "I regret the suffering," he admitted, "but I believe in the possibility of a better realm under you. If I can help you find that path, then my regrets become lessons." She turned to him, expression weary but touched by the faintest glimmer of hope. "I want to be that ruler. I do." Tyrion gave a small bow. "Then keep listening to wise counsel. Keep your heart open to the people's needs. If we can do that, the realm might yet forgive." She reached out, briefly touching his shoulder. It was not a gesture she often made. Then she withdrew. "Good night, Tyrion. Good night, Your Grace." He watched her disappear into the shadows of the keep. In that fleeting moment, he felt a flicker of belief that Daenerys might truly grow beyond the pyres of King's Landing. If so, his illusions would serve a noble purpose. If not, Westeros would drown in dragonfire again. As the months slipped into a turning of seasons, the air grew crisper, the first hints of autumn giving way to shortened days. Ravens arrived with news that Jon had returned to Winterfell and presented Daenerys' proposed arrangement to Sansa. The details remained uncertain, but no armies marched, no open defiance flared. Tyrion took that as the best sign he could hope for. He intensified his efforts to fortify the realm's roads, muster local garrisons, and rebuild the crown's finances. On the surface, everything appeared to move toward a precarious peace. One dawn, a raven arrived from Sansa herself. Tyrion received the scroll, reading it with careful attention. "My compliments to the Queen. We acknowledge her desire for a peaceful realm. We will meet at Harrenhal in 3 moons' time to discuss terms. The North will not be forced to kneel, but we will speak of cooperation. Tell the Queen I come in good faith. Sansa Stark." Tyrion's heart lightened. A meeting was better than silent animosity. He hurried to deliver this message to Daenerys. She read it, jaw set, then nodded curtly. "Very well. Harrenhal it is. Tell Grey Worm to prepare an escort. We'll leave in 2 moons, so we have time to travel safely." And so the date was set. Envoys from other houses would likely attend, curious to witness the negotiation. Harrenhal had long been a haunted ruin, cursed by the fires of dragons in days of old, but it remained large enough to host many guests. Perhaps that was symbolic, forging a new peace in the ashes of an ancient seat destroyed by the Targaryens. Tyrion saw the irony and prayed the meeting would not end in another blazing ruin. On the appointed day, Daenerys led her retinue out of King's Landing. Tyrion rode beside her in a modest carriage, scanning the road ahead. Drogon soared overhead, a black shadow blotting out the sun now and then. The small folk along the roads paused to watch, some falling to their knees, others running in fear. Tyrion felt the weight of the spectacle. The conquering queen traveling to treat with a rebellious region. Even now, it remained uncertain which side truly held the upper hand. After a grueling journey, they arrived at Harrenhal. Its gargantuan towers still bent like melted candles. The topmost levels collapsed from dragonfire centuries past. A hush fell among the travelers, as though the ghosts of old kings and queens lurked in the blackened halls. Outside the massive gates, Sansa Stark waited with her own retinue. She stood straight-backed in northern furs, her red hair pinned, her gaze cool. Beside her was Brienne of Tarth, face set with stoic resolve, and a group of northern lords Tyrion recognized. Lord Glover, Lady Mormont's cousin, a Royce from the Vale. The dynamic was clear. Sansa had come prepared for diplomacy, but not without strength. Daenerys dismounted from her horse, eyes flicking across the ruin. "Lady Sansa," she greeted, her voice carrying in the still air. "Queen Daenerys," Sansa replied, dipping her head in deference. She turned her attention to Tyrion, giving him a thin smile. "Lord Hand." Tyrion bowed slightly. "Lady Sansa, it's good to see you well." She nodded, though a flicker of emotion crossed her face. "Shall we proceed inside?" Sansa gestured to the half-intact Great Hall. "They've prepared a space for the talks." And so they entered Harrenhal's vast interior. The hall stank of damp and mold, its high windows shattered. Braziers were placed around, though the cold seeped in from every crack. Guards lined the walls, unsullied on one side, northern men on the other. Tension crackled, but neither side reached for weapons. A long table had been set in the center with benches on either side. At one end, a dais stood where once a throne had been placed. Now it was just a raised platform of scorched stone. History weighed heavily in the corners. Daenerys took one seat, Sansa another. Their attendants spread out behind them. Tyrion stood near Daenerys' shoulder, scanning the northern faces. He recognized fear, defiance, curiosity. Sansa's expression remained composed. "Shall we begin?" she asked softly. Daenerys inclined her head. "Yes, we come to secure peace." Sansa's lips curved in a hint of a smile. "Peace, indeed." She glanced at Tyrion. "You have the proposals, I assume?" Tyrion stepped forward, producing the documents they had painstakingly drafted. He handed one to Sansa, kept another for Daenerys. The large sheets of parchment spelled out the terms of partial northern autonomy, a pledge of mutual defense, a structured tribute, and a recognition of Daenerys' sovereignty in matters of realm-wide significance. Sansa read it carefully, Brienne peering over her shoulder. Tyrion noted the frowns on certain northern lords. They likely did not relish paying tribute to a queen who had burned King's Landing. At length, Sansa set the parchment down. "Some points are acceptable. Others require adjustment. Tribute, for instance. The sum is too high for the North to sustain after the hardships of war and winter. And your text stipulates that the North must petition the crown before forging alliances with foreign entities. We value our independence in trade and treaties." Daenerys leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You want independence in everything but defense? That is not how a kingdom works. If the North is part of Westeros, it abides by the crown's laws on alliances." Sansa met Daenerys' gaze unflinchingly. "We do not seek to undermine you, only to preserve our unique position. The North's resources are scant. We rely on some foreign trade for survival. If every treaty requires your approval, it ties our hands." Tyrion cleared his throat gently. "Perhaps a compromise. The North may negotiate minor trade agreements on its own, but must inform the crown of any alliances involving military obligations or large-scale territorial concessions." Daenerys exhaled. "Fine, but the tribute stands as written. We need resources to rebuild King's Landing and maintain the realm." Sansa's jaw tensed. She looked ready to argue. Then Brienne touched her arm lightly, and Sansa paused. She turned to the northern lords, a silent communication passing among them. Then she faced Daenerys again. "Lower the tribute by a quarter, and we have a deal on that point." Daenerys' eyes flicked to Tyrion, who offered a slight nod. She let out a slow breath. "A quarter," agreed, "but no less." An uneasy hush followed. Tyrion felt relief that they were inching toward a middle ground. He jotted notes on a smaller parchment to amend the documents accordingly. Next, they tackled questions of law enforcement, whether the crown had authority to judge crimes in the North or if it would be left to local lords. More back and forth ensued, with Sansa insisting on northern prerogative, Daenerys insisting on overarching royal justice. Tyrion proposed a structure wherein the North handled local crimes, but if the accused fled south, the crown could intervene. Each compromise was hammered out, line by line. Hours passed. Braziers burned low, and servants brought in simple fare, bread, salt beef, watered wine. Tyrion realized with a faint, grim amusement that this was the kind of negotiation he had always imagined might happen if the realm sought a more balanced governance. The only difference was the lingering threat of a dragon outside and the memory of how quickly Daenerys could shift from negotiation to devastation if she felt cornered. By nightfall, they had a working draft of the agreement. Each side made concessions, each side claimed small victories. Daenerys retained the title of Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. The North recognized her as sovereign in matters of realm-wide concern, and the crown in turn acknowledged the North's right to self-governance in most daily affairs. Tribute and mutual defense were agreed upon. Final signatures would await Sansa's formal acceptance, presumably after she consulted with her council in private. Tyrion believed they were close to something workable. As the negotiations ended for the day, Sansa and Daenerys stood. Both looked weary, but neither was openly hostile. They exchanged polite farewells, planning to reconvene on the morrow to finalize details. The Watchers dispersed, some heading to assigned chambers within Harrenhal sprawl, others pitching tents in the courtyard or beyond. Tyrion accompanied Daenerys to a room that had been hastily refurbished for her. The door shut behind them, and Daenerys sank into a rickety chair, pressing a hand to her temple. "That woman is stubborn," she murmured. "And you are not?" Tyrion teased lightly. When she shot him a look, he sobered. A day ago, you would have called her your enemy. Now you've nearly forged an agreement that brings the North into cooperation. That's no small feat, she exhaled. If she abides by it, yes. She will, Tyrion said, hoping it was true. Sansa Stark does not make promises lightly. Daenerys rubbed her eyes. I'm so tired of war. This arrangement, if it holds, might spare us another. But if the North breaks it, Tyrion's stomach nodded. We'll cross that bridge if it comes. Daenerys waved a hand dismissively. You should rest, Tyrion. Tomorrow will be another long day. He nodded, stepping out with a final bow. Making his way through Harrenhal's labyrinthine corridors, he found the chamber allocated for him, a small, drafty room with a single bed. He lit a candle, ignoring the scurrying spiders in the corners, and settled onto the bed. His mind raced. Was this the culmination of all his illusions? A realm so battered by war that even the proud North might find a compromise with the Dragon Queen? If so, he could claim success. Yet he sensed new dangers lurking. If either side felt cheated, they might turn on each other with renewed vengeance. He dozed fitfully, dreaming of flames bursting from the mouth of a dragon, swirling illusions turning into black smoke. He saw the silhouette of Sansa, crowned in ice, facing Daenerys crowned in fire, while he stood between them, strings in hand like a puppeteer. When he woke to the gray light of dawn, he realized his hands trembled. The illusions he had woven were nearing a critical point, and the slightest breeze could send them toppling. Morning came, negotiations resumed. There were minor disputes, but no major collapses. By midday, they had refined the final draft. Sansa requested one last concession. A set of written assurances guaranteeing the crown would not station large numbers of troops in the north unless a realm-wide emergency demanded it. Daenerys bristled, but Tyrion calmly pointed out that the north would likely never rest easy if the Unsullied patrolled its roads. Eventually, Daenerys relented. More lines were inked, more seals prepared. Sansa accepted the final iteration, signing with a flourish. Daenerys then affixed her name and seal, proclaiming it law. Tyrion felt a thrill of relief. This was history in the making. A structured compromise that acknowledged the North's near independence yet kept them tethered to the crown. If Sansa honored it, if Daenerys upheld it, Westeros might finally have some semblance of order. The hall rang with the echo of stamping seals, a momentous hush following. Sansa rose, clasping her hands. I'll abide by these terms, she said, and I hope the Queen does as well. Daenerys stood, shoulders squared. I will. Let the realm see that we are no longer at war. She glanced at Tyrion, a trace of gratitude in her eyes. For once, fear was not the dominating force in the room. Soon after, Sansa and Daenerys parted with guarded civility. Harrenhal's courtyard bustled as the northern party prepared to leave, the Targaryen retinue likewise. Tyrion oversaw the final exchange of signed documents, ensuring copies were made for both sides. As he watched Sansa mount her horse, he caught her eye. She guided the horse closer. Tyrion, she said softly, perhaps one day, the North will truly trust this queen of yours. I suppose that rests largely on you. He bowed his head. I'll do my best, Lady Sansa. The realm can't endure more flames. Her mouth curved. Be careful. You once said you were good at drinking and knowing things. Make sure the knowing part helps keep the peace. He inclined his head in acknowledgement. She spurred her horse, leading the northern contingent out the massive gates. Tyrion watched them go, feeling a strange mix of respect and lingering sadness for all that had happened to the Starks. Then he turned to help Daenerys's group prepare for their own departure. Drogon circled overhead, a reminder of the destructive power that still cast its shadow on every negotiation. The journey back to King's Landing was smoother, buoyed by the sense of accomplishment. The illusions now had some official shape, some lines on parchment that lords and ladies could reference. Tyrion recognized it wouldn't erase old grudges instantly, but it might hold them at bay. For the first time, He allowed himself cautious optimism that Daenerys's reign might not be overshadowed by unending rebellion. When they re-entered the capital, the battered populace saw the queen return with fewer scowls on her face and a certain calm in her bearing. Rumors spread that an agreement with the North had been reached without bloodshed. People dared hope that stability was closer than before. Tyrion quietly fanned those rumors, instructing the town criers to mention the peaceful treaty, urging scribes to pen songs praising the queen's benevolent compromise. Illusions, yes, but illusions that could shape reality. In the weeks that followed, Tyrion witnessed subtle changes. Dorne sent word of a new delegation wishing to negotiate trade. The Vale, hearing of the North's arrangement, decided it might be safer to submit more openly to Daenerys's rule, especially if autonomy was respected. The process was not instant, but the realm began to knit together, house by house, region by region. Tyrion continued to orchestrate it all with his letters and coded communications, guiding certain factions to see opportunity rather than threat, ensuring no single rebel group formed a critical mass. Every so often, Daenerys would speak to him in private, grappling with her own lingering guilt and the demands of the throne. He remained her hand, guiding her away from extremes, reminding her that each act of mercy built trust, each moment of cruelty fueled resentment. She listened, albeit not always with full enthusiasm, but she listened enough, and the city lived on, reconstruction continuing, trade reestablishing. The contrived illusions of fear and favor slowly gave way to a more stable arrangement, albeit still overshadowed by the memory of fire. Tyrion took solace in his achievements. He had manipulated the greatest war Westeros had seen, turning Lannisters and Targaryens against each other, forging a cataclysm that shattered old power structures. Out of that chaos, he had shaped a new reality. A queen who ruled through a blend of authority and compromise, a realm in which the North maintained enough autonomy to avoid outright revolt, and a fragile system that could grow into something resembling a fairer order. Was it perfect? No. Shadows of the past always lingered, and many resented the crown. But it was better than endless war, better than stagnation under incompetent kings. On a mild autumn evening, as the leaves turned golden in the crownlands, Tyrion once again stood on a balcony overlooking King's Landing. This time, he sipped a cup of wine with a quieter sense of triumph. Below, the city's torches glimmered, not in fear, but in the bustle of normal life. He could hear distant laughter, a merchant's cry, the chatter of children. The dragons, or rather Drogon alone, still soared overhead at times, but not to cast devastation, merely to remind the realm of Daenerys's might. A gull swooped past, heading toward the bay. Tyrion followed it with his gaze, recalling how different the city had seemed when he first arrived as a boy, overshadowed by Tywin's presence. Now Tywin was gone, Jaime was gone, Cersei was gone. House Lannister, as it had been, lay in ashes. Yet here stood Tyrion, the most influential Lannister of all, though few realized just how deeply he had shaped the course of events. He remembered the coded letters, the whispered deals, the betrayals orchestrated. He thought of Varys, Peter Baelish, and all those who had once played the Game of Thrones with subtlety and cunning. They were gone or forgotten, but Tyrion had learned from them. He had outplayed them in the end. He turned his gaze toward the newly rebuilt gates, imagining how caravans would flow in and out, how traders would help feed the city, how the taxes would replenish the crown's coffers. He imagined the future, perhaps a generation from now, when the next crisis arose. Would Daenerys still rule with a firm but measured hand? Would the next generation of Starks abide by the treaty? Would the illusions Tyrion crafted endure? He could not say for certain, but he had faith that he had given the realm the best possible chance. In the coming months, Tyrion continued his work. Day after day, letter after letter, conversation after conversation. He cemented alliances with the Vale, assured the Iron Islands their share of autonomy, coaxed the Reach to flourish again under new leadership. Dorne, too, inched toward reconciliation. The unstoppable tide of life replaced the stench of carnage. King's Landing might never forget the horror of its burning, but it rose from the ashes nonetheless, forging a cautious acceptance of the queen who once unleashed the flames. and Tyrion was there to smooth every sharp edge, to dispel every rumor of renewed war, to remind Daenerys that mercy bred loyalty. Over time, she learned to value the gentle approach more often than not. Years would pass, and songs would be written about the Targaryen queen who seized kings landing in a brutal conquest, only to reshape the realm through compromise. Some songs would celebrate her wisdom and talk of the new peace. Others would condemn her for the day she burned the capital. And some would mention her hand, Tyrion Lannister, perhaps praising him as a voice of reason or damning him as a cunning schemer. Yet none would know the full truth, that he had orchestrated the war from its earliest sparks, nudging pieces on the board to ensure the old guard fell and a new order rose. None would know how every coded letter, every morsel of misinformation, had paved the way for dragon and lion to clash, for the realm to be shattered and then reborn. In private, Tyrion would sometimes revisit his hidden alcove beneath the Red Keep, a place where dust motes still danced in torchlight. There, he would sit on the cold stone floor, rereading old coded scrolls, each one a testament to the invisible strings he had pulled. He would think of the thousands who died, soldiers, small folk, lords and ladies, and wonder if the end truly justified those means. He wrestled with that question in the quiet of his heart, sipping wine that no longer tasted sweet. But in the end, he reminded himself that his illusions, however ruthless, had averted an even greater catastrophe. Had the old powers remained unchecked, the realm might have descended into endless, grinding wars, or the White Walkers might have triumphed. He had steered events so that Daenerys could unify the realm just enough to prevail against the dead, then break the Lannister hold, then sign a treaty that recognized the North's unique position. It was a monstrous tapestry, yet it bore a semblance of order. He took comfort in small mercies, orphanages that sprang up in the city, trade routes that thrived, roads secured from bandits. He saw people from once warring houses laboring side by side to rebuild the capital. He heard Dothraki children laughing in the streets, no longer bent on pillage but integrated into a new life. He observed that the City Watch, now reformed under a new banner, treated the populace with greater fairness than in the days of Joffrey. All these subtle changes added up to a realm that might one day transcend the brutal feudal legacy. Such was the culmination of Tyrion's design. He had not wanted the realm to remain in the iron grip of House Lannister, nor had he wished it simply to trade one tyrant for another. He sought to break the cycle by unleashing chaos and then guiding it toward a carefully structured peace. And if a final war had stained his hands with blood, he rationalized it by believing that fewer would die in the next generation, thanks to the illusions of unity he had spun. Standing on a parapet as dusk fell one evening, Tyrion considered the shape of that legacy. Daenerys might remain queen for years, or perhaps fate would cut her rule short. The realm might remain intact, or new challenges might arise. He could not control everything forever, but for now, he had given Westeros a lull in the storm, and that lull might blossom into genuine stability if people allowed it. He sipped his wine and let the breeze caress his face. He thought of Jaime and Cersei again, how House Lannister had soared to such heights only to collapse. He thought of the dragons, ancient power reborn to terrify and enthrall. He thought of the Starks, who had endured unspeakable losses and still stood. And at the center of these recollections was his own small figure, the dwarf who had once been mocked as an irrelevant outcast, yet who had proved that knowledge, cunning, and patience could move mountains, or even dethrone kings. A final smile tugged at Tyrion's lips. He raised his cup as if in a silent toast to the city below, to the illusions he had woven, to the realm he had shaped. Through war and fire, through betrayal and cunning, he had done what no one else could. He was, in his secret heart, the grand architect of the war, the quiet manipulator of lions and dragons alike. The world might never sing his name as a savior or curse him as a monster, for they would never truly know. But that was how Tyrion preferred it. A spider weaves its web in the shadows. A puppeteer stands behind the curtain. True power thrives in secrecy, and he had learned that lesson too well. So Tyrion Lannister stood beneath a darkening sky, wine in hand, gaze turned outward. The faint voices of the city rose up, mingling with the hush of evening. Far off, Drogon roared, a sound neither wholly menacing nor gentle, but something ancient and unearthly. Tyrion listened, heart steady, mind alive with possibilities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, fresh letters, and further illusions to maintain. And he was ready to meet them all, because he had become the hidden soul of the realm, the unacknowledged conductor of Westeros's grand symphony. Let the realm believe in their dragon queen, their proud northern lords, their illusions of peace. Let them never suspect that in quiet corners, pen and parchment had orchestrated it all. For as long as Tyrion drew breath, he would ensure that this fragile new era stood a chance of flourishing, woven from the threads of his cunning and sealed by the echo of dragon wings. And that, he decided, would be enough.